This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate second part of what if Naruto makes Mizore fall in love with him. If you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And for more exclusive and spicy content, follow me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
The waves below her seemed desperate to have her, and she could see her own clones approaching them from above. She took a moment to gather herself, and as her storming eyes suddenly drained of emotion, her clones lost their ice claws and appeared to return to being nothing more than dolls. Her dolls died without her emotions pulling their strings, and she felt a crossed piece of metal in her palm that was attached to Sukune's. Her dolls broke into ice as a wave of uncontrolled Yuki suddenly splashed over them in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, she was thrown skyward as a feminine arm lifted Sukune. A woman with long white hair and attractive curves appeared to be boredly staring at her as her vision cleared. She had a black choker around her neck, but it lacked a familiar rosary. Her eyes met Mizore's, who seemed unconcerned while the other was extremely bothered. "Now you're criticizing me for such trivial things?" The sight of Sukune's heartfelt apology did not register with the white woman, Mocha, who had her powers released and her other personality questioned. Mizore consciously relaxed her hands and said, "I'm not going to thank you." She was unable to respond to the kick that abruptly pushed air from her lungs and threw her to the ground. Mizore's hands were in a fetal position as she lay on the ground nursing her stomach, and her other hand went to her necklace for solace, feeling only the circular one her mother had given her. Although her mother had claimed it was merely a gift, Mizore knew what her mother truly meant. She wished she had that necklace with her when she said, "You have to move on, Mizore." Sukune running after her with a worried expression on his face was the last thing she saw with her eyes barely open. Before she passed out, Mizore wondered, "Am I supposed to feel happy, Naruto?" After regaining consciousness, Naruto said, "That felt real." He stood up again and examined his body for any anomalies. But then he noticed that the seal he had drawn was glowing in his peripheral vision, and as soon as he turned to examine it more closely, he was shocked to see that it was still functioning even though it had lost some of its original functionality. He examined the cause with wide eyes and trembling hands, and he felt happiness seep into him. Nature chakra had penetrated the seal, using his body as a conduit, and it was powering the seal. Instead of searching for traces of his chakra on living things, the seal was designed to look for energy storages, such as the one he had placed in the necklace he had given Mizore. His lips tugged upward as the hope in his eyes returned. Kazushi was filled with shock and pride as he gazed at the masterpiece, which had taken the shape of an oval and covered a huge clearing in front of him. The trees surrounding him rustled and swayed to an invisible wind. Their crowns shaded the entire work as they towered, far taller than any other tree in the area. Their trunks were thick and strong, a few meters in diameter. The only strange thing was the green lines that ran down the trunks of the trees toward the roots rather than the seal, which glowed a faint green. Closer to the center, a circle of purple and green lines sprawled all around a wooden door. As the clones completed extracting the last of the seal, he heard the distinctive puffs of his grandson's clones dispersing. After 5 years of being harassed by his grandson's clones for their seal teaching, he and his wife hardly had time to teach Naruto and their daughter anything else. They would train Hitomi and Naruto with a group of his shadow clones that allowed him to learn at godlike speeds, and occasionally more clones of Naruto would appear from wherever they had been practicing seals to drag either him or Miyuki off. At first, he had harassed them hourly, but by the end of the first year, it had gradually decreased to daily. Once every few days by the time it reached the second year. It had recently increased to once a month, so it bothered him that Naruto hadn't visited either Miyuki or him in several months. He could see that the 5 years of harassment had not been in vain. Kazushi muttered, "Heck, if he actually pulls this off, then this be one thing he's better than me in." Miyuki struggled to decipher the seals, and both of their jaws were hanging rather limply open as the sheer magnitude of what was about to happen hit them. Even though there were some remnants of his seal strewn throughout the seal, even he was perplexed because the original seal he himself used for dimensional travel was nothing compared to his. Hitomi joined them, her eyes widening as she said, "Ka-san, 2-san, where?" "Ar." She wasn't as knowledgeable about seals as her parents, but she could still make out a few details here and there. Hitomi, Obaken, Miyuki, Sobo, and Kazushi. Sofo. When the three turned to face Naruto, they saw him approaching them with a kind of happiness in his eyes that Miyuki and Kazushi hadn't seen in 5 years. Naruto appeared rejuvenated and full of energy, he didn't even appear to be tired. "Is this what I believe it to be, Naruto?" Kazushi asked reluctantly, straining to make sense of more of the seal on the floor. "Yes." Naruto glanced back at the seal, which was pulsing with life energy, when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned his head to the left, where a maternal Miyuki gazed at him. Did you remember to look at the power output limiters? Naruto replied succinctly and clearly, yes. Have you checked the power storage's integrity? Yes, Naruto said with a slight drawl. What about security measures? Yes. He was beginning to feel the effects of Miyuki's critical gaze. How about taking emergency measures? Naruto started to perspire icily, and Miyuki's eyes briefly glowed. There are barrier seals in place in case something goes wrong. Drain seals in case there is on overload and an anti-personnel seal just in case. For a moment, Miyuki's intense stare made Naruto resist the impulse to dab at his perspiration with trembling hands. Then it was all over, as if Miyuki hadn't just pressed her maternal instincts, nagging, into his soul. Naruto could just hear Kazushi's faint laughter in the background. He put on his game face and steeled his body. Like Sofuse, my seal will form a tunnel through dimensions. However, it can also link to multiple dimensions at the same time. Kazushi stopped deciphering the seal to look at Naruto, which made Naruto feel proud of his advancement. The primary distinction, though, is that the inner tunnel will be covered by an outer tunnel composed of natural energy. While experimenting with nature energy a few months ago, I discovered that it can company flow with other types of energy. This stunned Kazushi and Miyuki, who had thought it was impossible to use nature energy with seals centuries before because it was just too powerful to bend to a seal's will. Howdy. Nature energy is too powerful for seals to bend its flow towards them, Naruto said, one step ahead of them. I therefore used my Mokuton, wood, style to grow those 3 trees. The collector seals were connected to their trunks and roots. In this manner, the energy of nature enters them directly. At this point, Hitomi was completely lost, her head darting between her parents and her nephew, and she was beginning to feel a little lightheaded. Miyuki felt sorry for the poor girl just before swirls appeared in her eyes. She steadied her head with her hands and gave Miyuki a feeble smile. Basically, Naruto's seal will create a dimensional tunnel and protect it with an outer layer of nature energy to prevent disruptions from other energy waves, in this case your leaked energy. Kazushi observed Naruto's appearance and said, I'm going to follow my intuition and say that you already prepared to leave. Naruto wore a gray long, sleeve shirt with blood-red rims, a vest with multiple camouflage compartments, and dark blue pants that were just a little bit larger than his legs and reached his ankles. He also had a thigh pouch on both legs. Naruto's smile conveyed everything. What will the tunnel lead to, then? Miyuki inquired. Since I don't have any marked locations, I'm just going to make it retrace the latest tunnel that opened, Naruto said, tapping his chin with his right index finger. As he considered meeting the girl with the purple hair, he added in his mind, straight to Mizore's home. I hope she's okay. He began his masterpiece by directing tendrils of his energy to particular spots on the seal. The 3 trees' green lines appeared to pulse even more intensely. The energy they contained spread throughout the seal in the manner that the seals directed it to. The actual sight was breathtaking. The seal appeared to light up in incomprehensible patterns in some places. From the edge of the seal in front of the family toward the door, an energy-based walkway began to take shape. Off, Kazushi pondered. Even though Naruto's ego was growing, the prospect of meeting the Shiryukis was more important than anything else. More precisely, he was thinking about a girl with purple hair who was grinning and holding a sucker in her mouth. Her pale yet exotic skin and her soft-looking lips. There was an indescribable joy in his heart. She was only a few moments away. Aaa Sukune Aono is just your typical teenage student. The funny thing was that he would be the odd man out wherever he was. Everyone in his immediate vicinity, including the students and teachers, was a monster. He had ended up attending a covert monster school that killed any humans who found them, either by accident or by choice. When he first started attending a few months ago, he was like the typical person who freaked out when he found out what kind of school he was in. Entering a state of shock in which his body was overloaded with adrenaline and his heart was racing, making his actions more reckless and exhausting. Fortunately, he had already established a friendship with Ayashika Moka. Moka was a vampire with a strong seal that protected both her abilities and her vampire nature. On their first day of school, she had managed to run Sukune over with her bike. She had briefly allowed her vampire instincts to rule her while she was dazed and lightheaded. She pushed herself forward, drove her teeth into Sukune's neck, and became addicted to his human-like blood right away. She was the reason Sukune Aono had stayed at the school and continued to be a contributing factor in his decision to stay. Aaa Surara thought it was just another ordinary day. Her husband was occupied at work, and her daughter was away at Yukai Gakuen. Her resort had recently experienced financial difficulties. Then her train of thought was cut short and it fell out of her grasp, shattering her teacup as it hit the chilly floor. She began to doubt her sanity when a dark green frame materialized in the same spot where it had been. There was a door inside that looked grayish brown. She took a hesitant step in its direction and watched as the door creaked open, her eyes wide and dilated. A hand appeared, tanned and familiar. Her body trembled as the door opened further. Faces familiar to them appeared. She asked with a smile, Naruto? There was another well-known voice. It was the same light-hearted voice she hadn't heard in 5 years, saying, "Don't forget about me or Miyuki either, Surara." Aaa Yukai Gakuin's headmaster Mikagami Tenmei was presently seated behind his desk in his office. Usually, he would be working on his ever-increasing paperwork, which was threatening to consume him every day of his life. Even worse, he was currently engaged in a less than cordial conversation with one of the school's faculty members, Shizuka Nekonomiya. Shizuka was pointing angrily at a disturbance outside his room window, which he kept denying. As the events outside, which strangely enough included a large group of students at a stake with a boy bound to it, went on, she became progressively paler. They appeared to be at some kind of execution rather than school. If we don't do something, he really is going to die. Shizuka nearly let out a cry. With a weary expression, the headmaster continued to work. Shizuka could only look on in shock. If he is to die today, then so be it. If not, then he will not die. Aaa Kido, a member of the school's Public Safety Commission, told the assembled students of Yukai Gakuin, 1. Today we shall witness the death of one of our true enemy. Sukune Aono is a human. The crowd immediately began to murmur, some in disbelief, others in outrage. Yukai Academy, their school, was meant to be surrounded by a unique barrier that would have prevented humans from entering. As she watched the student body begin to back Kuyu, Kido couldn't help but smile. This filth will be executed in 2 hours at noon. She could already feel her proud master grinning at her and praising her for a job well done. She was even more thrilled by the boy's predicament after sparing a glance at him. Observing the faces he had begun to accept, he saw their contorted expressions of disbelief and hatred. He was afraid that he would die here by himself. Perhaps Jin Senpai was correct. In the newspaper club room, Sukune Aono and his friends were talking about a topic that was somewhat taboo at school. Sukune Aono yelled, somewhat naively, "The Public Safety Commission is corrupt. We have to tell the students the truth, in the name of justice." Jin, also known as Jin Morioka, the resident werewolf, put his foot down and said, "No, don't be a fool. As your club president I will not let you." The door to the club room opened before anyone else could say anything. Everyone turned to face the door, and as soon as they saw the intruders, one face turned pale. Jin stepped back, his eyes widening in terror. This was not overlooked. The head of the Public Safety Commission, Kuyu, said, "I see you remember me, Jin. I have recently gotten reports on all of you and I have to say, I am greatly displeased. Not only are you running an illegal club but now you are all also disobeying a direct order from the Public Safety Commission," Kuyu said. Jin appeared behind Sukune with a hand clamped over his mouth, interrupting him as he said, "We're only preaching the truth." "Sorry Kuyu. Sama, you see I had already told them to stop but they wouldn't listen," Jin begged. The color of Kuyu's face darkened. "Ah, that explains it. However, I am here on different business. Sukune Aono is under arrest under suspicions that he is a human." The other girls in the room let out several yells of indignation. A young witch named Yukari said, "That's not possible." Kurumu yelled, "Don't spew nonsense," as she fixed Kuyu with her fiery gaze. Though her eyes widened, the snow woman simply asked, But it was Mocha's anxious eyes that truly struck a chord with Sukune. As he watched the scene unfold, Kuyu's grin nearly covered the whole length of his face. "The rest of you here are also to come with us for questioning." He turned his back and allowed some of his twisted excitement to fill his eyes as his subordinates stepped forward to escort his suspects to his headquarters. Aaa Kuyu looked at the girl in the binding and said, "You know, of all the monsters I've ever had the joy of interrogating, I must admit that your species hasn't been one of them." Mizore simply gazed into his eyes without interest. "The fact that you're the silent type only makes this even sweeter." As soon as Kuyu flexed his arm, flames surrounded them. "I'll ask again. Is Sukune Aono a human?" The heat seemed to be bearing down on her without her succor, threatening to reduce her to ashes by burning. No, she didn't say anything more because it wouldn't have changed anything. Kuyu's upturned palm gave birth to a bright blue flame, and the shadows it cast on his face seemed to darken every unflattering feature. Even when the flame was only a few centimeters away from her face, her calm demeanor remained intact. But the heat was already taking its toll on her body. Her world was becoming disoriented. The Kitsune demon's pointed ears reached the ceiling, the shadows danced behind him, and the two dark patches on his head seemed to accentuate the serene, dark emotion in his eyes. The smirk on Kuyu's face did nothing to calm the fear that was rising inside of her when the flame abruptly went out, causing her to raise her eyes. His ominous grin seemed to rob her eyes of their brightness. "I can't have you melting now, can I?" he asked. His hand mockingly slapped Mizore's cheek, saying, "Don't worry though, I have all the time I want to find the best ways to go about this without making you melt." Her mind was filled with images of her mother and her mother being with her in her early years. She had enjoyed times with Sukune and his group. The struggle for Sukune's affections that she had with Mocha, Yukari, and Kurumu. But her heart pounded when she saw pictures of a particular blonde friend that seemed to stay in her mind longer than the others. Her mind was suddenly filled with a searing hot pain that tore a scream from her throat. Her nose was filled with the odor of burnt flesh. Her own flesh. Despite her thrashing, she was held tightly by her bonds. Her hands were restrained to the chair's armrests by two metal cuffs on each hand. Her back was securely fastened to the chair by multiple lengths of rope, and two metal cuffs on each leg secured her legs to the chair's front legs. Kuyu traced patterns on his whims as he painfully slowly moved his finger down her left forearm. Blood began to seep from areas of her charred flesh, leaving a line of red flesh behind his finger. He moved in squares, circles, around her arm, and then back up. He stood back and appreciated his 15-minute artwork. Her forearm was severely burned, and the exposed flesh where the skin had burned off twitched and pulsed. He appeared to observe his artwork slowly. Her arm wasn't the only one. It was the whole of her. Her body trembled, her face was filled with pain, and her breathing was labored. He deliberately took his time, ensuring that the Yuki-onna cooled sufficiently to prevent melting. Because he literally couldn't control the heat, Kuyu didn't want to lose his new toy. He pulled a metal pin from his pocket and heated it until it glowed a pleasant red, and a twisted glee filled him. His victim trembled slightly at the sight of the pin he held above her right forearm, and he seemed to feel alive as he soaked in the fear she exuded. She let out another scream as he began using the tip of his pin to make delicate patterns on her arm. As he abruptly pushed the needle in a centimeter and carried on drawing patterns, a sob that was coming out of her became lodged in her throat. Her skin wrinkled and burned, giving way easily. Her hand was covered in rough grids after he finished working on it. Let it be known that Kuyu had a good sense of humor as well. Ever heard of a game called Tic-Dot-Tac-Dot-Toe? He walked with an extra bounce in his steps. He was okay despite the near-death experience he had just had at Sorera's hands. He shuddered as he reflected. She was initially taken aback, but in a matter of minutes, she was overcome with rage as she stared at them, barely able to control her behavior. The question had seemed to be directed more at him than anyone else. Do you know what Mizore has been going through? It had taken him by surprise. He hadn't given that much thought because he had spent the last few years completely focused on building a stable dimensional tunnel. He felt guilty because he could only imagine what Mizore had gone through when she last saw him, being impaled and hit by falling debris. Fortunately, his grandmother demonstrated her wisdom once more. She had already prepared to console him, so she knew what would have happened. It had been sufficient to have a comforting hand on his shoulder while her eyes communicated her message. His grandparents were aware of Sorera's suffering. The anguish of seeing your kids suffer. Sorera's tears were streaming down her cheeks as they allowed her to express all of her frustrations. Midway through his stride, the 16-year-old boy stopped and raised one hand to feel the snowflake hanging from the simple necklace he had made. He saw flashes of blurred images of something he thought he should know. Shaking his head, Naruto dismissed the emotion and returned to his initial task. So when I call for the bus driver here, he comes. He twisted his head to the left and right to double check where he was. He was fairly certain he was in the correct location after noticing the pumpkin concealed behind a bush and the crude pole standing next to it. He directed some of his Yuki into the pole by placing his hand on it. Nothing took place. Nothing changed when I looked around. A slight breeze brushed his body as the leaves of the trees swayed gently. A seal glowed, and he raised his hand to examine it. They lit the dimensional interference seal. Near him, a portal was being opened by someone or something. Abruptly, a huge yellow monster rolled toward him down the street. The mouth opened as it came to a stop before him. The conductor's eyes were bright as he gazed at him. He said, "So you're the special request from Kazushi?" Without even blinking his eyes. His words were clear even though his mouth hardly moved. Naruto jumped on the bus with a quick dip of his head. Naruto sat close to the back of the bus and asked the conductor, "Bus driver, what kind of school is Yukai Gakuen?" It was a blur of the world around him. As Naruto entered his field of vision, The driver's bright eyes glinted off the rearview mirror, asking, "It's a different school, first day?" Naruto acknowledged, "Yes, even though I'm not really there to study." He was thinking a lot about a girl with blue hair. A few of his seals appeared to light up as the surrounding world gave way to a glowing tunnel. He raised an eyebrow at what he saw when he looked at his hand. Both the dimension tracking and dimensional interference seals were in operation. "This is one interesting tunnel you've got here, bus driver." The driver's eyes just seemed to sparkle in response to his query. The only indication that the driver understood was a slight widening of the driver's smile. Another world soon appeared, with a dead ocean on one side and dead trees on the other, with only a cliff separating them. He gave the driver a final glance as he stepped off the bus. They both realized at that very moment that they had grown to respect one another. As he leaned against his bus and smoked a cigar, the bus driver reflected, "Perhaps I ought to have informed Mikagami that someone like him was joining today." He puffed out, "Meh," and white smoke poured out of his mouth. Naruto stretched his senses along the only path that was visible and rapidly reached a number of conclusions. 1. The dead trees that encircled him were, in fact, barely alive. 2nd, there were more powerful beings present. One of them possessed the same level of power as the bus driver. 3rdly, a sizable population was concentrated in a single location. He flew off after entering a partial transformation using a trick he had learned from Miyuki, invisible to everything in his immediate vicinity. Aaa Sukune raised his head to meet Kito's and said, "We have 30 more minutes before you die, scum." His eyes were filled with fear. He was so worn out from all his pointless fighting that his entire body felt empty and numb. Nothing had changed when I looked over the sea of anonymous faces once more. The student body appeared eager for him to pass away. He dropped his head again and spared another look at the window leading to the headmaster's office. The corners of his eyes are already welling with tears. Mikagami's window opened with a slight creak, as though it were caused by an unseen force. If it was possible, Shizuka's eyes appeared to enlarge even more, and Mikagami just set down his pen before turning to face the window with a smirk already on his face. Suddenly, the air wavered and shimmered as if there were a piece of cloth in it. Then a figure emerged. Naruto said, "More as a declaration than a query, I take it that you are the headmaster of this school?" He sounded fine, but there was a faint hint of irritation in his voice as he said, "Yes, I am. I see that my friend has neglected to tell me of some things. You may call me headmaster." Naruto took a letter out of his left thigh pouch and gave it to the headmaster. Unbeknownst to most, Mikagami used a tiny bit of his yuki in the letter. He responded by sending a few more tendrils of his yuki into the seal after the seal confirming that it was from the bus driver returned a small amount of yuki. He and his friend had devised a unique method of communication. They would write a letter, but the key ideas could be condensed into quick yuki pulses. Positive. Special, student. The letter was placed on the headmaster's desk. Taking a moment to look out his window, he had a brilliant idea because he could actually feel the blonde's immense power concealed behind a dam. Although he was unable to determine the blonde's level of authority, he could tell that, even for him, it was nothing to laugh at. "You will be notified of your classes and dorm room later. For now, why don't you head down and join the current student gathering by the Public Safety Commission?" "Sure." The new student's only remaining clue was the slight sway of his curtains. He turned his chair to face the student body and decided to put his paperwork away for the time being. He was almost oblivious to the nearly insane faculty member standing next to him. He clasped his hands together and fixed his glowing eyes on the scene in front of him. Perhaps I should have warned him that it's against the rules to reveal his powers in monster form here. This will be interesting. He never took his eyes off the grin. Most people couldn't see him, but he sat at the top of the stake that held the bound boy. Reminded of his early years, he couldn't help but let a small frown appear on his face. His right hand reached into his shirt to finger a snowflake while he gazed up at the clouds. There was a strong unease. The noise abruptly subsided and silence descended. Every person in the vicinity turned to look at the doors that had been flung open. As the crowd dispersed, he walked down the aisle that had just formed for him, his lackeys standing proudly at attention. As he made his way to the raised stage, there was silence, broken only by the soft pads. Several of his goons, each carrying a wooden stake, had just dashed ahead of him. 4 stakes were positioned evenly around the mass of wood that Sukune was bound on top of by the time he arrived at the stage. As the students naturally understood the purpose of those 4 stakes, a somber air seemed to pervade the entire space. As he closed his hands around the snowflake, Naruto's sense that something was amiss seemed to grow stronger. The sound of a machine operating could be heard as trapdoors suddenly opened. People were lifted onto the platform one by one. The first showed a soaked girl with pink hair. Occasionally, what appeared to be sparks sparked off her body, giving the impression that she was in pain. A faint groan was then heard as a blue-haired girl with noticeable purple bruises on her face and limbs emerged through another trapdoor. She had swollen parts of her body, and the swelling on her head had forced one eye shut. The third shorter person emerged, and a sound of sobbing filled the room. Although she didn't appear to be physically hurt, her body was extremely tense and her facial muscles were twisted, giving the impression that she was in excruciating pain. The remnants of her wand were in front of her. A silence that was ever more subdued than the first took over when the fourth came. Even the thoughts of everyone seemed to be silenced. Her body was sweating, her breathing was shallow and labored, and her purple hair was in a mess. Her left hand was burned and deformed, while her right hand was red and swollen. Her legs appeared to be nothing more than bits of red flesh adhered to her bones. Her face was the worst. There was only one kanji on each of her cheeks. Ju was written on her right, and Yao on her left. Her face was burned with the word Kuyu. Even though she never looked away from her front, her eyes appeared hollow. While his heart began to bleed, Naruto's mind was in hysterics and endured chaos. As his logical mind attempted to regain control, his hand around the snowflake froze. He was still using his invisibility technique because it came naturally to him. He began to look at her legs. Her calves appeared to have been skinned all the way up to her mid-thighs. Her bare muscles appear wrinkled as if salt had been sprayed on them. Her skin appeared burned at the edges. To put it another way, her arms were completely destroyed. Parts of her pulsing flesh were visible through dry, cracked skin on her left arm. Her right arm appeared to have been partially diced, with a circle or a cross marking each piece. The image of her would become ingrained in his mind forever. The brand on her face, in particular. Perched there, he simply felt numb. In his mind, everything appeared to register. His heart pounded slowly and thunderously, and his eyes were wide open. He was unaware that Kuyu had set his palm on fire. He seemed unconcerned even when the fire starters were lit. He was so focused on the girl with the purple hair that he didn't seem to care that the other three girls were yelling for help, for someone to come and save them, and the boy, Sukune. Both from memory and from the pictures Surara had shown him, he was able to identify her. He could recall the thrill and delight of arriving at last. But now that his ideal day was passing by faster than he could even realize, it seemed unattainable. Something inside of him suddenly broke. He didn't express his feelings in a loud or forceful manner. He drew the attention of the student body by canceling his cloaking technique. He felt for the fires that had begun to burn beneath him as he stood to his full height. The fires turned into tiny energy whirls and flew into his body in a split second. It seemed as though there had never been a fire, save for the burned wood. He abruptly found himself in front of his first friend using another of his speed techniques. He gently raised her head by holding her chin between his thumb and index finger. They looked at each other. She could still see through his composed exterior. There was a firestorm raging in his apologetic eyes. When uniformed individuals got within 5 meters of the blonde, they immediately leapt back in agony. As minor explosions occurred on their bodies, they crumpled onto the ground, suffering third-degree burns on their front. Kuyu's eyes narrowed as his analytical mind tried to decipher what had transpired. He then noticed a slight distortion in the surrounding air. The air surrounding the blonde had been superheated in a circle. Anyone who ventured into the ionized air suffered severe physical harm. Since he had a high regeneration factor, he had neglected to learn healing techniques and was unsure of what to do next. Fear bubbled through his body as their eyes spoke in ways their words could never. Naruto's peripheral tracked Mizore's movements as her left hand moved feebly in spite of the searing pain it caused. She reached into the pouch of her thighs. Her gaze remained fixed on his. As she held up a necklace, his heart tightened. Reddened by her blood, the silver phoenix hung. To show her the snowflake, Naruto's hand retrieved it. Happiness and reassured recognition flashed in her eyes. Even though she wouldn't be able to spend any more time with Naruto, she was happy to see him again. "I'm going to die," she said, content and relieved to have one last chance to see him. Naruto was aware. He had seen that expression far too frequently in the past. Mizore's heart froze at the fatalistic acceptance in his eyes. "Mizore," Naruto uttered in a rough, broken whisper. "Naruto," she said with a smile on her lips. Despite the brand, Naruto thought she was still attractive. Despite the sadness, his own mouth reflected a tiny bit of her smile as tears began to well up. Her eyes closed slowly. He took his necklace off and put it in Mizore's right hand. He put her hands over her chest and closed both of her palms. He took a few more moments to study her form. Then he tore his eyes from her. He created a barrier around Mizore to keep the heat out by moving one of his pre-made seals from his hand to his feet. The majority of the student body would not be able to recognize him as the culprit behind the soon-be massive reservoir tap because he placed another of his seals on his feet and used a masking seal to mark the ground beneath him. Naruto released 4 controlled discs of fire with his final sane thought, and they quickly took off. After that, the world was reduced to a blur. Mizore, keep my promise safe. My training is already low on energy because I've been careless. It will melt if you don't get up and recharge it right away. I'll take care of this, so be careful. Kuyu smirked as he watched the interloper's power grow. At last, he would face a challenge. He abruptly moved to his right, slightly widening his eyes. Shortly after, a fist emerged in the place of his head. Naruto's hands' muscles trembled. He and the intruder began a lethal dance. His amused grin never left his face. His opponent abruptly stopped. He froze for a second, staring back at his opponent's face. His opponent's face reflected icy orbs and pure rage. A tiny bit of fear was sown in his mind as a result. Suddenly, a much larger release of energy swept over the area, pushing Kuyu slightly backward. Around him, his men fell to their knees, and the student body appeared to be mimicking frozen statues. Weaknesses. Kuyu sneered in his head. Kuyu immediately assumed his true kitsune form, bypassing his initial metamorphosis. His chiseled torso was exposed by his clothes burning away. His smile was getting bigger as his opponent showed no signs of being deterred. He had discovered a worthy victim. Fire rose in a circle from the tips of his 4 neon blue tails, which spun in a circle behind him. He launched a wheel of blue fire in the direction of his adversary. Smoke filled the air, and there was a loud explosion. However, Kuyu could still sense his opponent's presence, so it wasn't over. He managed to avoid another fist that would have taken his head if he had been even a fraction of a second slower by twisting his body to the left, folding his left leg, and pushing out his right leg. Kuyu leapt out of the cloud of smoke. Another wheel of fiery energy was created as his tails spun once more. His opponent stood in front of him with his icy blue eyes fixed on him while he waited for the cloud to pass. 2 wheels were launched by Kuyu. On both sides, they closed in on his adversary as their paths curved. The wheels of fire appeared to transform into tiny wisps of fire, similar to the one he had started earlier, and enter his enemy's body, sowing the seed of fear in Kuyu's mind. His opponent's strength suddenly increased as if to make fun of him even more. The blonde was encircled by a pillar of white energy before it vanished. But the energy boost persisted. In this school, Kuyu experienced genuine fear for the first time. Because it was straining to contain so much energy, even the massive barrier that shielded the school appeared to tremble. Kuyu was not even aware of it. His right arm was pierced by a beam of light that emerged from his opponent's eyes. The amount of killer intent, ki, emanating from his opponent paralyzed him, causing him to lose the wet, squishy sound of his hand hitting the ground next to him. His breathing became more difficult as the energy continued to rise. He could see his goons and students crumpling to the ground around him, their eyes wide open with fear and wheezing. As the molecules that comprised the air surrounding his opponent, no, the monster, became charged with energy, the air appeared to distort around the boy. The monster he was facing was leaking raw, uncontrolled energy, and the air was filled with a fine, swirling yellow mist. The blue-haired succubus shuddered in place, unable to look away from the sea of power that appeared to be a human. Minutes earlier, she had wondered in her head what kind of monster could have created such a controlled disc to sever her bonds. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know now. Her entire body jumped when a hand suddenly touched her shoulder. She turned her head and saw that it was Mocha, who appeared to be about to fall. She continued to shake, though. She could see that the energy leaking from the monster facing Kuyu was still having an impact on her, even though her friend had managed to get here. Mocha's knees were on the verge of giving way, and her eyes were trembling. She closed her left hand around another girl's smaller hand. Yukari appeared weak and confused, but despite the pain visible on her wrinkled face, her fear seemed to be masking everything else. The light blue star, the remaining piece of the witch's destroyed wand, was in her left hand. Mocha appeared to be looking up, and with her presence, she was able to follow the monster's line of sight while squinting painfully. When she saw Sukune, who had also been set free from his bonds, her heart leapt. He was on his knees, though, and his breathing was irregular. For a brief moment, she thought she saw Sukune's eyes turn red, but she dismissed it as a trick of her own fear. The object of her affections abruptly collapsed to the ground. Regretfully, he was positioned at the top of the wood pile. She was able to snap out of her fear-induced state when she heard Mocha gasp next to her. With excruciating pain, she released her wings, gave a powerful flap, and went to stop Sukune. The pile of wood abruptly burst into full-fledged flames, freezing her world. Kuyu threw wheel after wheel of fire at his opponent out of desperation, When they were within 5 meters of the blonde, all of them vanished. His movements became erratic and desperate. He launched it haphazardly, shoving the majority of his Yuki into one more wheel. This wheel has more than 100 times the power of his typical wheels and is several times larger than his previous ones. From where the monster had stood, he heard a loud explosion. He could sense a twisted laugh rising as a thick cloud of smoke engulfed the area. I did it. I killed him. Kuyu's insane laughter erupted from his throat as he lost all control over the facial expressions on his body. One thing that everyone else did that he missed. The enormous power of the monster continued to exert pressure. The smoke spread easily as a sudden surge of raw power pushed from the epicenter. Sukune was lying from the partially burned pile of wood. His eyes had been replaced by red orbs, but his body was only slightly burned. As a huge, uncontrollable wave of Yuki swept across the area, vertical slits flashed. Nearly everyone else who had stayed awake fell asleep at the sight of the three of them together. His signature Yuki flickered as his eyes continued to flash. His unsteady presence vanished a moment later when he fell into a succubus's gentle arms. As shock tore through his body, Kuyu stopped laughing and took a step back, his eyes widening in disbelief. Naruto remained where he had been throughout. He didn't seem out of place in the slightest. Shortly after, Naruto materialized in front of Kuyu, his fist only a few centimeters away. However, the blow failed to make contact. Kuyu was still influenced by his pride even as he faced death. His opponent was making fun of him, so he clenched his teeth in anger. He was informed that he had no chance of winning and that the monster would decide how long he would live. But he realized the monster wasn't truly a monster when he looked into its eyes. Despite his incredible strength, his opponent wasn't a monster at heart. Kuyu couldn't resist smirking. He would survive if he played his cards correctly. He moved to the side, taking care to avoid the fist that was still aimed at his head. The words, "You have to understand. I was merely trying to punish a rule breaker." The other four, the vampire, witch, succubus, and snowworm, were caught in his throat as Kuyu saw the spark of pure, unadulterated rage in his opponent's eyes. Putting his feelings aside, he resumed. With each sentence, Kuyu felt his chances of surviving this day grew. The other four were his accomplices. They had to be interrogated. Interrogation? Was Mizore subjected to interrogation? Naruto's head was divided into two opposing sides. It's true that Mizore was his friend, in fact, his first friend, but could he really still stand by her if she had turned evil and a criminal? Once again, Kuyu's analytical skills were put to the test as he tried to interpret the boy's feelings from the smallest cues on his face. He was already thinking about how the boy and the snow girl were related. It seemed as if Kuyu was experimenting to see how far he could go. Besides, what are friends anyway? Friends come and go. So what if you lost someone like her? My friend is Mizore, but what exactly is a friend? She lusted for that human boy every day, competing with the other four for the boy's affections. Should someone like you really waste this much effort over a useless whore? Is Mizore just a worthless whore? She would never turn into this kind of person, would she? Naruto's perplexed eyes focused on the girl with purple hair who was shielded by his barrier. Surara had already informed him that Mizore had discovered her true love. He still didn't know why, but his heart had squeezed then, just as it did now. His gaze strayed to her closed hands above her heart, where his promise reminder was kept. His heart recalled, but his mind was disoriented. He had spoken on their behalf, saying, "We'll always be friends, no matter what, it's a promise." Did he not make a promise? He had vowed to himself that he would never be unfaithful. Would you, accompany me to pick Snow Whites when I turn 17? Yes, Mizore. Chan. I promise. She looked into Naruto's eyes and held it in both of her hands. This is our promise. The snowflake was his gift, his promise, and his reminder, wasn't it? Thank you, Mizore. He opened his closed eyes and walked with a sense of calm that he had regained. Before anyone knew it, he was behind Kuyu, and Kuyu was out like a light after receiving a simple hard chop. Until he understood what was happening, he would not make any decisions that were irrevocable. He would guide Mizore back if she had really gone in the wrong direction. She would have quickly pulled a number of weeds if she hadn't. After all, he was Mizore's friend, and even though they had a close relationship, they were still just friends, right? Naruto convinced himself that he had no right to feel anything but happiness for her if she had found love. One sweat had trickled down his back, nervous. He had briefly feared that his plan would backfire and bring down the Great Barrier. He turned around and resumed his work. The pressure had caused Shizuka to faint, and he lay crumpled on the ground next to his window. He had to admit that the boy had a lot of power. But in a matter of seconds, his thoughts were elsewhere, already formulating plans to return the favor to the bus driver. The headmaster only needed to notice the slight stirring of the wind. Mikagami sensed the veiled anger in the calm question, "What kind of school are you running, headmaster?" He mined. Stroked his pen down smoothly and straightened his back slightly. He presented a rather menacing image with his hood down and his bright eyes. Even when the student didn't respond, the damnable smirk on his face persisted. The faculty and the Public Safety Commission have had some agreements. Naruto's eyes narrowed and his lips tightened into a line. The headmaster turned back to his work with ease, practically ignoring him. On a side note, your dorm room is ready. You may collect your key at the front desk of the school office. The clone had already departed in order to finish his task. He gazed longingly at the girl and muttered her name under his breath. While some clones were sketching a summoning seal on the ground, others were concealed throughout the dorm room for safety. He covered his heart with his right hand in an attempt to ease the physical and mental agony. When he put a sucker in his mouth, he actually went to his knees. His reserves were now much larger, making the power drain more agonizing and exhausting. He had recovered so quickly because of a great deal of willpower. He made a mental note of how much power he now had to create limiter seals in the future. What hurt most was the power drain caused by the low temperature. He took her delicate, horribly pale hand in his and touched her wrist with the tip of his finger. That only served to confirm that she was still alive. He had no idea what her typical pulse should be. She was obviously not feeling well, though, as evidenced by her fast heartbeat and feverish condition. His anxious gaze swept over her body. He had used the ripped bed linens to bandage her limbs as best he could, but he was at a loss as to how to treat her face. He chose to focus on her face instead of tracing his fingers over the marks to demonstrate that they were phony. He could relate to the pain on display, but he was alarmed by the faint signs of calm and resignation. If he wanted her to continue fighting, would that be self-serving? In order for him to see her alive once more. His tense muscles were accompanied by a harsh whisper, "Don't you dare leave me now, Mizore. Don't you dare be content with just seeing me one last time." Desperation threatened to ensnare his thoughts. As he lowered his head to the phoenix on her chest, which was outlined by the snowflake's edge, he saw his red hair, which was occasionally streaked with gold. Thankfully, his clones were made with specific goals in mind, in addition to the distinct chakra and yuki systems. The seal glowed a little when it was done, and then a plume of smoke with a flattering poof emerged. Raising her guard, Miyuki found the person who had called her, her eyes bewildered. She was about to chastise her grandson for calling her here needlessly when she noticed a beseeching expression in Naruto's eyes. She hesitated as she saw the desperation whirling in his eyes, but as he returned his attention to the bandaged girl, she was guided to the figure next to him. When she noticed the brands on her cheeks, she let out a soft gasp because they simply didn't look right. When she looked at the bandages later, she saw that some of them were red because blood had seeped into them. The girl's concerns were not alleviated by the ripped state of her clothing. She was unaware that her hand had extended to caress the marks on the girl's face or that her legs had brought her closer to the girl. However, she paid attention when a firm hand clamped over hers only a few centimeters away from her face. Her eyes met Naruto's, and she was startled out of her reverie by an emotion she had never witnessed directed at her by her own grandson. His spuriously calm eyes were filled with barely controlled anger. Refocusing, she shot him an apologetic glance. A faint blue aura surrounded her hand as she held it with her palm facing down. She moved her hand from head to toe while hovering a few centimeters above the girl. After finishing, the green glow faded, and she reluctantly composed her next words while gradually pulling her hand away to buy more time. Naruto wouldn't want to hear it, but could she really tell her grandson a lie in that circumstance? Her eyes met Naruto's as she slowly stilled her sides by her side in an attempt to buy more time. She didn't try to water it down because of the naked pleading in his eyes. Her wounds are tainted with very potent yuki and the marks on her face have, she said, but her words stuck in her throat because she could actually feel Naruto's grief permeating the space. She cleared her throat quickly and silently. The wounds on her face have been laced with chemicals that make it extremely hard for them to heal. Impossible even if you grafted skin, but with my abilities there is a slight chance I can heal her. Naruto's body stiffened and he asked, "Then what's the problem?" More like a controlled shout. His gaze had returned to Mizore's dozing body. Despite the girl's injuries, she appeared too calm, and now that she realized it, she felt a little uneasy. Despite the pain etched on her face, there were hints of peace there, and her breathing was slow and steady. With concern for both the girl and Naruto, Miyuki concluded, it will take weeks for her limbs to allow her basic mobility again. Even longer for her muscles to heal to their usual healthy states. But there is no guarantee she'll make a full recovery. She will probably be scarred for the rest of her life. Naruto's red hair cast a shadow over his face, and his head was lowered. The room was far too silent to be broken. Miyuki silently dropped a beacon seal and directed her Yuki in particular directions using predetermined patterns. She left a few seconds later with a quiet poof that Naruto did not hear. Energy by itself wouldn't help, so she needed to gather her medication. It would take time for Naruto. An empty trash can was filled with bandages. The white had become rusty brown. Sitting next to Mizore, Miyuki applied various chemicals gently while injecting Mizore with her Yuki on occasion. The only indication that she was still alive was the soft rise and fall of her chest. Her expression was calm and emotionless. Her body did not have the strings of a doll. Every few minutes, Surara wiped the frozen tears from her face as she combined a variety of herbs on her left. With his dead eyes fixed on Mizore, Naruto sat in a different corner of the room. He was dressed the same as he was yesterday. His door was sealed and his belongings were still unpacked. Naruto's legs were spread out in front of him, and his hands were limp by his sides. Kazushi used the beacon seal to teleport into the dorm room, and a poof indicated his presence. He was holding several more ingredients that Miyuki had asked for. He set the materials down on a table and stopped for a moment to look at what he was seeing. His skin seemed to absorb the somber atmosphere. He sat down next to Naruto and couldn't help but flinch at the expression on Naruto's face. It was exactly the same as his. Gazing at Miyuki and Surara, Kazushi said absently, "You should get up and take a breath of fresh air." Naruto remained silent. Rather, Naruto bit down on the sucker in his mouth, making a tiny cracking sound. Kazushi went on, "You should start working on your schoolwork and perhaps even go work out a little." He could see a slight tensing of Naruto's muscles in his peripheral vision. Kazushi continued, "You shouldn't just sit here, Naruto." This time, he could clearly see the boy's muscles tensing up as a range of emotions flashed through his eyes. Naruto did jump this time, pushing himself up with his legs as his face met Kazushi's. Sitting down here, lost and confused, isn't going to help Mizore. His arms were fisted at his sides, and his face was filled with confusion and anger. Tiny slivers of his controlled energy escaped, his eyes strained and wide. What was he supposed to do? His eyes begged. He seemed wise as he talked some sense into Naruto's head. "Think, Naruto. You could do something even I couldn't. Where did that spirit of yours go? You spent 5 years trying hour after hour to meet her again despite the fact that the chances of it actually happening were almost zero. Now that you've finally gotten to see her, are you just going to give up at this point?" he asked. Kazushi forced himself to stand up, his eyes flashing as he remembered how he had been. He had broken up with Miyuki after they appeared to have lost all of their daughters. He would go days without eating or sleeping. Then he recalled how Miyuki had saved him, and his heart began to soften. There had been some fighting, but she had talked some sense into him. He didn't turn around. He was certain that he had completed the task at hand. After sending out some of his Yuki, Kazushi felt the beacon seal on the island pull him in a familiar way. On a lighter note, he smiled a little. I'll miss creating dimensional doors. Although Naruto's seal was effective, moving the current tunnel or building a new one requires a significant amount of natural energy. Growing those big trees everywhere would be absurd. Furthermore, even I am not entirely sure what his seal means. I suppose I'll have to rely on calling forth seals for the time being. He sobbed passionately and left the room. Naruto left the room, followed by Sarera's worried gaze. Miyuki was too preoccupied with Mizore to pay attention. Surara refocused her gaze on Mizore. "Mizore, what are you going to do?" The silver phoenix that rested on her daughter's chest, outlined by the snowflake her daughter had given Naruto, appeared to be the main focus of Sarera's unsaid query. When she saw gifts, she could tell they were genuine. The silver phoenix was adorned with elaborate patterns. Its creator most likely painstakingly carved the eyes and snowflakes. She still remembered the months Mizore had spent learning how to make that shape, and then there was the necklace. Then to create it from just one ice crystal, a feat that could only be accomplished by a snow Ona who was genuinely sincere. He looked up at the night sky with blue eyes. His eyes reflected the twinkles of the stars. Why did Mizore have such an impact on him? Was a friend meant to have such an impact on a person? He reached up out of instinct, but the snowflake was gone. He felt cold all of a sudden, as if the night's darkness were creeping up on him. There was a familiar but unwanted sensation in the pit of his stomach. He felt isolated. He pulled his legs to his chest as he shivered uncontrollably. The darkness was heightened by the building's gloomy architecture and the trees that appeared to be dead all around him. There was silence. Even the night-dwelling insects didn't make a sound. It was cold and still. His eyes glazed over, memories racing through his head. Every time Mizore smiled at him, he felt an inexplicable pull at his heart, and the image of her happy face seemed to stay with him. The image of her branded face then took over everything, resembling a scene from a nightmare. However, unlike in a nightmare, a voice challenged him and listened to the back of his mind, asking him what he was going to do about it. His usual determination rushed back, and his eyes took on a familiar glint. As he observed, Naruto stood to Miyuki's right, just behind her, analyzing everything she did. Every time Miyuki responded to Naruto's question about the effects of a particular medication, the thick silence in the room was broken. Naruto observed her behavior objectively, but his gaze would soften whenever it strayed to Mizore. A shadow clone behind him erased all of Miyuki's words. The header at the top of the page said, "Second day of treatment." He would make a clone every hour, and it would dispel, delivering fresh data to the other clones. As they ran around experimenting with seals, batches of his clones once again occupied the island where he had been stranded for 5 years. Gaining the memory of one of his monitor clones made him shudder. Not much progress was made. What was unsettling, though, was that some of his clones would transform into tiny phoenix statues when they absorbed too much nature energy from a seal backfiring. The clones failed to dispel, send any chakra or yuki, or bring back any memories. The nature chakra was constantly directed toward a medium, such as a wooden door, while he was working on the dimensional seal. He was now trying to inject living things with nature chakra, but the results weren't good. His eyes were rimmed with worry as he returned his focus to Mizore while twirling the sucker in his mouth. Despite Miyuki's best efforts, she was still asleep. He looked at her chest once more, and he couldn't resist confirming to himself that she was still alive by observing the gradual, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. As Miyuki returned her hands to her sides, the dim green glow that had filled the room for hours faded. Her body was already overworked from channeling different amounts of healing energy for hours on end, so she went home to relax her tense muscles. She walked away without saying anything. A tiny indicator seal on the dorm room door illuminated once more as she was finishing. Every few hours, that seal would light up to alert its creator that someone or something had been attempting to channel some of their energy into the space. He returned his focus to Mizore with a faint undertone of annoyance. She would have been relocated to their house, but her illness had made it impossible. Naruto looked at her closed eyes. Like the previous seal, this one would illuminate every few hours to alert its maker to the possibility of someone or something physically breaking the door or of someone knocking on it with a lot of force. He crawled into his futon, his body facing Mizore, ignoring it as he had all the other times. Thousands of black-clad people stood. They solemnly bid farewell to their fallen leader. Sarutobi Hiruzen had fallen while on duty, and he had died a shinobi's death. The entire village was in a festive mood earlier in the day. Sasuke Uchiha, a child prodigy, was taking part in the last round of the Chunin examinations, which were scheduled for today. But when Sasuke's finals opponent, Gaara, who turned out to be the one-tailed beast's container, went crazy, hell broke loose. He had given his body over to the demon. The village had descended into chaos due to the lunatic demon and waves upon waves of sound and sand ninja. Sarutobi was imprisoned behind a barrier by the orchestrator, Orochimaru, a former pupil of Snake Sennin and the Sandaime Hokage. They were there to fight, one for his village's sake and the other for twisted humor and retribution. As they soaked in the ensuing chaos, Orochimaru's dependable elite squad, the Sound Four, kept up the barrier. The Kusanagi, Orochimaru's favorite sword, was soon discovered deep inside his chest by the third Hokage. As Leaf Ninja perished one after another, their leader's laugh reverberated throughout the village. The weakest Biju raged off in the distance, leveling structures and crushing people as it caused chaos. Orochimaru's happiness was short-lived, though, as ninja squad after squad of people wearing black coveralls and white animal masks started to show up all over the village. As the one-tailed Biju was brought down, diverted by massive masses of earth hurled in its direction and sealed by a gigantic ink trap, his rage was evident on his face. As he got ready to personally see Konoha destroyed, his grip on his sword tightened. Orochimaru, you are to be executed for crimes against the Leaf. He avoided a potentially fatal blow by ducking to his left thanks to years of honed instincts. He reassessed his circumstances, cursing himself for allowing his rage to cloud his judgment. At least 30 Leaf Ninja, each with a hidden symbol that read Root on their masks, surrounded the Sound Four as they fought an Anbu squad. A smile spread across Orochimaru's face upon seeing the symbol. His free hand crept slowly in the direction of his pouch. I see that Danzo hasn't keeled over yet. I wonder how he'll react when he learns that a certain snake has certain information that could potentially harm his organization. His smile widened as the members moved slightly to let an elderly man pass. Every time his walking stick struck the hard roof tiles, it made a sharp tapping sound. The snake saw Danzo's face fixed in its eternally stoic expression. He said in a stoic but slightly irritated tone, "Orochimaru, you will only get this offer once. Leave the Leaf Village and never return, on account of our past dealings." Orochimaru's face broke into a full-fledged grin. Although he couldn't ensure that the leaf would be destroyed today, Danzo's takeover would be far worse than anything he could have done. His leave was marked by a faint wishing of leaves as he gathered his more important staff. The others would divert his attention. As he proceeded down the corridor, Naruto raised an eyebrow. The pupils appeared to be typical. Had he experienced some sort of amnesia as a result of his massive energy release? They couldn't have already forgotten that day after week, could they? He shrugged his shoulders and pointed to the piece of paper he was holding. He checked the sign by looking up. He was in this class. He made 2 knocks before entering the classroom. The woman who greeted him was wearing an orange skirt and a white blouse. However, it was her orange tail waving languidly and the slight twitching of her furry ears on her head that drew his attention. He quietly sent out a tiny wave of his inner energy while glancing idly over the rest of the class. He quickly identified the group of girls surrounding a boy with extremely low power levels as he mentally assessed the power levels of everyone in the class. Then, to his brief bewilderment, he noticed a glint of recognition in their eyes. Only those 2 girls in the class seemed to recall his brief performance. He saw more than a few dreamy, loving eyes staring at him, as well as more than a few envious, hateful eyes glaring at him. Recalling her memo from yesterday, the teacher declared, "Class, we have a new student. He just joined us a few days ago." While the mood of many of the boys in the class darkened, a few sections of the class let out feminine squeals of excitement. He nodded slightly and examined each person's eyes in a basic gesture of recognition before saying, "My name is Naruto, nice to meet you all." He made his way to the end of the class and got ready to take a vacant seat. As he passed the small group, their eyes seemed to follow him everywhere he went. Both of them narrowed their eyes at him, displaying caution. He stopped in the middle of his stride, turned abruptly, and sat down next to her. "You can't sit there, Naruto-san. Mizore already sits there." Sukune Aono greeted Naruto with a smile. He gave the boy a slight nod of acknowledgement before shifting his focus away from the curious stares of a succubus and a vampire. Unaware of the growing hostility between Naruto and 2 of the girls in her class, Shizuka had already begun her lecture. The succubus's 12th attempt at conversation struck Naruto in the face, causing his eyebrow to twitch. Unbeknownst to anyone but Kurumu, he picked up the piece of paper and burned it with a brief, tiny burst of fire. As she suppressed the annoyance that would have made her look foolish, an animated tick mark pulsed on her forehead. The first note had been quite simple. "Who are you really?" was the theme of each subsequent note, though her handwriting became more agitated. She pulled out another piece of paper and her pen. Her note abruptly burned halfway through the writing process. Her eyes widened as she jumped in her chair and looked at the little pile of ashes on her table in disbelief. She had thrown her pen across the room. "Ouch!" Miss Shizuka exclaimed as she spun around and looked at the tiny pen that had struck her in the head. She ran forward as soon as she saw Kurumu's body position. She hissed, baring her claws. As her claws drew closer to the succubus's face, she emphasized each word. "Kuruno. Detention. 4 hours." She waved her tail slowly and menacingly behind her. Kurumu leaned back as her teacher's claws got too close for comfort, causing her to snap her head in front of her. Her eyes darted from claw to claw as she squeaked, but it was an accident. Naruto made me do it." Shizuka's head jerked up, and she looked at Naruto. Her posture instantly relaxed. Her heart was purified of any negative feelings she might have had for Naruto by his seemingly innocent face and sparkling blue eyes. Shizuka appeared to be pleading for his pardon with his repentant eyes. Her righteous anger returned with a vengeance as she turned back to Kurumu. Her severe expression made it impossible to argue with her. "Don't you dare insinuate that someone as kind and innocent as Naruto would do such a things. For that you've gotten yourself another hour of detention." Kurumu's jaw was agape. She glanced at Shizuka's back before turning back to Naruto. She was only able to sit motionless and let her anger fester while muffling her indignant cry. Mocha cast a worried glance back. Naruto had put his stoic mask back on and was partially focused on the lesson. Sukune only gave Kurumu a pitying glance for her detention, still unaware of what had just transpired between Naruto and Kurumu. Naruto traversed the woodland. As he passed, the lifeless tree appeared to reach out to him. The bat's glowing eyes appeared to be watching him. The majority of life was absent from his surroundings. In actuality, the Great Barrier at the school was quite large. He had clones running around close to the Great Barrier's edge, marking the surrounding landforms and the ground with lines and symbols. He had explored the entire region that his seal denoted as well as a few kilometers beyond. He directed his chakra into a particular black line that was drawn on the ground in front of him. His hands released green chakra, which crawled inch by inch into the line. They divided into two channels and went around the seal in two separate circles. In both circles, a sapling grew at incredible speeds. For almost an hour, he struggled to maintain a steady output of wood chakra, straining his muscles. He could already feel his energy levels dropping, and his breathing became a little labored. The green lines, which began at the two trees, then took on a light shade of green once they had reached a height of roughly 10 meters. He got back up and wiped the perspiration from his brow. Even though the two trees on either side of the barrier grew more slowly, they were still growing quickly. They would continue to develop until they reached adulthood. Waves of nature chakra flowed through his seal, pulsing every few seconds along the green lines that wound around their trunks. Before things returned to normal, a half-kilometer square area appeared to shimmer. His clones and seals vanished from his view. He grinned as he passed through the barrier. He had taken a chance, and it paid off. He had effectively incorporated nature chakra into a cloaking shield and barrier. His clones had already left to gather supplies to construct a modest home here. The dead ground in his barrier turned green as new grass appeared, and the trees inside seemed to straighten as leaves sporadically appeared on their branches. As she absorbed the faint light from the windows, her twin eyes slowly opened. She tried to recall how she had arrived, her bewildered gaze wandering. She found it much more difficult than usual to raise her left hand. She raised her hand and saw the bandages covering it. "Are you enjoying yourself yet, Mizore? Chan?" Her lip was bleeding from biting down on it to stop screaming, and Kuyu's face flashed as his twisted emphasis on Chan more than irritated her. "No," as he drove the blazing hot needle all the way down to the bone. Mizore clenched her teeth. Mizore jerked to her feet, wincing in agony as pain shot through her body, forcing her to bite her lips to keep from screaming. As she looked at her own body, she saw that all of her limbs were covered in white bandages, with 2 patches covering her cheeks and a few patches on her torso. The agonizing memory of her torture came flooding back to her. Her terrified eyes darted around, never settling on anything for more than a second until she heard a clinking sound. Her eyes snapped to the source, her necklace resting on the ground, and she was still drawn to the silver phoenix's blue eyes. Suddenly, she saw a snowflake next to it, and her trembling hand reached down to pick them up, enduring the agony that shot through her body as she ran her thumb over the smooth ice. The single crystal was still there, but the blue glow it had once possessed had faded. She sent some of her Yuki into the crystal without thinking, and as its creator recharged it, a faint blue glow swiftly engulfed her hand. However, where was the person to whom its creator had entrusted it? Her heart tightened as her eyes flashed with her most recent memory of Naruto. Hadn't she come to terms with death? Naruto's pleading eyes seemed to weigh heavily on her heart. As far as she could recall, Naruto had never begged, pleading yes, but never begged. Her fingers slowly stroked the necklaces in her hands as their cords entwined. Like a certain phoenix and a Yuki, Ona, entwined, but how? He could have a workable training ground and relocate Mizore to a safer area with his barrier. He had just received another report from another clone that had just dismissed itself. The house's basic structure was almost finished. The primary seal had been supplemented with security and backup seals. He was abruptly stopped by a succubus as he turned a corner. Kurumu had been waiting outside his dorm room, spying on him. "Who are you?" she asked. She had been attempting to cut his door open, as evidenced by a few pink chips on the floor. As he stopped in front of the girl with the blue hair, his cheerful disposition was considerably dampened, and he hardened his eyes. He ought to have anticipated this, but he failed to do so. His emotionless tone seemed to irritate her. "Naruto." Then, to Naruto's surprise, she appeared to be thinking. Kurumu tried to poke holes in him with his probing gaze. "Fine, I won't bother with who you are, but you've had something to do with Mizore, haven't you? She hasn't attended class for days and none of us have seen her since that day. Where is she and what have you done with her?" Naruto saw no justification for lying when he said, "Mizore is currently recovering from her injuries," nor did he see the need to tell her anything more. Kurumu extended her fingernails to confirm his suspicions, saying, "I already checked with the school infirmary. She isn't there." "Don't lie to me." The nails on her right hand appeared to be chipped off. "She does not have to be in the school infirmary to recover, does she? Besides, why have you been trying to break into my room?" replied Naruto. After a moment of looking stunned, Kurumu leaned back a little and raised her fingernails in front of her, as though her hand had been caught in the cookie jar. Kurumu abruptly changed the topic as she gave Naruto another death glare. "So you do know where she is?" She already has a boyfriend, so you better keep your grubby hands to yourself. You better not have done anything funny either, bastard, Kurumu said. To get ready to strike, she moved her right leg behind her. Forgetting, in effect, that only a week before the boy had let out a ton of energy. Naruto didn't answer. Memories from his past had taken him by surprise, causing his eyes to glaze over. The scene had been somewhat reminiscent of his past. Recently, he had become overly busy, letting his unrestrained emotions attack his mental barriers and infiltrate through gaps to affect his thinking. He only jerked his body to the left due to his innate and conditioned reflexes. A sharp pain registered, and a fast pink streak flashed in his peripheral vision. On his right hand was a ferocious red line. He allowed his right hand to go limp while he bit back a guttural scream. A very deep cut had been made by the succubus. A significant portion of his bone had been cut by it. Until his regeneration took care of the radius bone, he would be unable to rotate his forearm for at least 15 minutes. As he concentrated his yuki on the area, he could already feel the itch and pain as his flesh and skin knitted back together. His shirt and the surrounding floor were soaked by the copious amount of blood that had leaked out. He tightened his left arm around the wound, gritting his teeth to stop any more blood from leaking out. He never took his eyes off his opponent, who was wearing a smug expression. "I think I'm just a big bluff," she said. This time, Naruto quietly adjusted his stance to prepare for a potential retaliation from the succubus. Since he or she might unintentionally cause an accident, he didn't want to fight the succubus here. Kurumu's yell echoed through the corridor. "Not so tough now, are you? Where is Mizore, you sick monster?" It's funny that despite the fact that girls weren't permitted here and a feminine shout had just been heard, the boys in the boy dorm hadn't come out to examine the hallway. Naruto irritatedly clicked his tongue. He sent a surge of energy to his legs as he eyed his door. His bloodied left arm reached for the doorknob as he dashed off. As he got to the door, he was shocked to see it open inward. He immediately saw a pair of shocked blue, purplish eyes as he dug his feet into the ground to stop himself from falling. Mizore's body had objected to her movements, and she was leaning to one side with her right arm gripping the wall. He just managed to avoid colliding with Mizore. Instead, with their faces less than a centimeter apart, their bodies made light contact. Mizore felt his labored breathing on her face as her gentle breath touched his cheeks. Their wide eyes were a reflection of each other's feelings. She weakly lifted one of her hands in an attempt to touch Naruto's face, whispering, "Naruto." Her body involuntarily leaned in, and her eyes faltered. "Mizo." Arg, as several strands of his saliva flew out onto Mizore's face, causing his face to suddenly contort in pain. He noticed 5 claws sticking out of his stomach when he looked down. Their tips left a red stain on Mizore's pale robe. His ripped shirt began to turn red, and the claws were mercilessly pulled sideways and pulled away from his body. Kurumu said, "Ha, you can't outrun me either, bastard," with a clear voice. Mizore's appalled gaze fixed itself on Naruto's twisted, agonized face. A lump of Naruto's flesh hit the ground, and she heard a sickening squelch. Mizore's eyes met Naruto's. Her heart leapt. Her expression rapidly changed to one of shock. "Hey, this is going to take some time to heal," he said with a dejected smile and weakly closed eyes as he collapsed onto his side. As Mizore gazed at her friend's tumbling body, her hands trembled at her sides. As she maintained eye contact with him for as long as she could before his eyes completely closed, everything appeared to slow down. Just as darkness took him, he activated a seal on his arm, which she was unaware of. Kurumu pulled her claws back into her hands and exclaimed happily, "Mizore. You're safe. I knew this bastard was keeping you locked up. Good riddance." Her happiness was short-lived when she saw that Mizore appeared to be a little frightened. Was it fear, instead? Horror, perhaps? As Mizore's blood began to fill with adrenaline, her heart began to beat more rapidly. Kurumu noticed her friend's condition and asked, "Mizore? Are you okay? He didn't do anything too bad to you, did he?" Her long hair fell over her face, casting shadows over her eyes as her body trembled with tumultuous emotions. Her blood had been flooded with adrenaline, which had numbed the pain from her wounds and prevented her from falling to the ground. Because if he did, Kurumu concluded by giving Naruto a fairly forceful kick to the body, sending him hurtling into the adjacent wall. Mizore saw nothing at all, not even red. Suddenly, the temperature of the air around them dropped to below zero, and the water vapor turned into snow, causing the wind to stir quite violently. Mizore's purple hair turned to ice, and her hands were covered in ice claws, and her hair froze over. Her robe flapped in the wind, and her eyes glowed. She resembled the legendary Yuki Onna in that she was strong and frightening. Kurumu was unable to respond. In a matter of seconds, she discovered a hard, cold fist embedded in her stomach. The blow knocked her several feet back. She immediately pushed her feet under herself, her eyes wide with shock, as a rather large ice shard the size of her head ended up where she had been only moments before. Mizore appeared to be just standing where she had been. It seemed as though the stories of Yuki, Ona attacking seemingly motionless were real. Her mouth moved slightly, and a melancholy melody drifted down the corridor. Kurumu had to avoid ice spears that had appeared everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, and the floor. She continued to get nicked in numerous places by the quickly growing spears, and the icy, meaningless music did nothing to help her focus. Kurumu stammered out, "Mizore. Why? What's wrong?" As her body struggled to keep from being impaled. She couldn't fly up in a closed space, and now everything was against her. As ice began to form on the walls and snow covered the ground, violent winds whirled around Mizore. As she watched the succubus continue to avoid her blows, she let out a deadly scream. Mizore instinctively raised her right hand and chanted a few words. Her hand's bandages were red from the reopening of her wounds. In front of her, a twister developed, sending ice and snow hurtling through it at lethal speeds. Kurumu was only able to watch in terror as the twister came toward her, oblivious to the smoke plume that had burst from behind her. The icy projectiles were hurled around at high speeds, leaving scratches and cracks on the walls. Mizore screamed once more, this time with such anguish and despair that it seemed to pierce everyone who heard it. When Kurumu heard the Snow Maiden's anguish, she couldn't help but shiver. Kurumu pushed herself as far back as she could, all the way to the end of the corridor, and created a huge gust of wind. Even so, it only seemed to postpone her inevitable demise. The hallway was being torn apart by the twister, which was turning into a blur of white as more ice formed in it. The walls themselves were scratched, and the wallpaper was torn. Her terrified gaze followed its progressively closer approach. As multiple stray projectiles struck their unintentional target, tears burst in her skin and clothing. She would be in excruciating pain in just a few more seconds. She turned her head down and squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself by raising her hands in front of her. She waited. She then waited. She then waited. When she opened one eye and saw that Mizore, the red-haired boy, and the twister had all vanished, she was relieved that the pain had never materialized. Even though she was perplexed, her relief at the time was far greater than anything else. She slid down slowly while leaning against the wall until she hit the floor. Her bloody hands lay limp at her sides, and her legs were in front of her. All she could do was inquire. What just happened? With a controlled sense of urgency, dozens of red-haired boys scurried about doing their work. They had all experienced a shift in their connection as copies of Naruto. The original had triggered a seal meant for emergencies, and they were aware that they were shadow clones. A portion of the inner energy of the original would be transferred to a default of 4 clones by the seal, allowing the clones to restock on their own supplies while learning that something had gone wrong. Although the seal itself was clever, it was incompatible with any other methods. The original's chakra and Yuki flow and reserves would be continuously impacted by the seal's continuous drain, which was proportionate to the amount the clones required to perform their duties of protecting the original. Therefore, it was only to be used as a seal when the original was at its most helpless. The 4 closest clones that had been linked to the supply hurried to the original's location almost instantly by following the source of their supply. An ice projectile had taken the first clone by surprise when it had arrived, causing it to dispel. The clone's memories had been transferred to the other clones, enabling them to take preventative action. One of the 3 that followed swiftly evacuated the first one. A long stream of superheated air was quietly exhaled by another clone. The air acted as a countercurrent, dissipating the tornado, while the ice inside the tornado melted upon contact. Mizore had been successfully transported out by the 3rd clone, who had gotten behind her. They were gone in an instant. Outside the academy in the woods, a tiny, localized snowstorm developed. It had frozen over all around. The snow, white ground and leafless trees appeared picture-perfect. Abruptly, a purple-haired girl threw a body that hit the floor. As he attempted to soothe the agitated girl, the clone swiftly stood back up, his hands swinging wildly in front of him. He leapt to avoid being dispelled by an ice shard. He found the other 2 who were en route to him by momentarily expanding his senses. He was also headed here with another clone that had been linked after the first had been dispelled. He barely avoided an ice spear by pushing himself off the tree's trunk. He felt nothing when he turned back to Mizore because, as a clone, he was devoid of the original's feelings. But he had work to do. Mizore. Stop! Sounded the clone's voice. Her eyes scanned the clone as the familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. Her heart wasn't persuaded, but her mind was relieved. He didn't seem sincere. She didn't know what was missing, but she couldn't figure it out. Yes, The clone's hands were making pleading gestures, and his familiar face had a pleading expression. She lost her ability to think clearly as her emotions took over once more. How dare someone pretend to be her Naruto? Was the only idea that crossed her mind. A wave of cold, bitter air flew horizontally as she swung her hands down. As the air blade sliced through the trees surrounding him, the clone leapt to his feet. He was stuck in midair, but he was unable to avoid being struck by multiple icy daggers. He was out of there with a poof. Mizore's body felt weak and heavy as she gazed blankly at the quickly fading plume of smoke. A sharp pain shot through her body, causing her to drop her suddenly heavy arms and fall to her knees. When her wounds reopened, her once white bandages turned red due to blood stains. She is plagued by the image of Naruto's body lacking a large amount of flesh at this precise moment. Her tears fell with a heartbreaking sob. Her mind was racing, her eyes passively staring off to the side. Perhaps if I had remained in bed, perhaps if I had been more patient, maybe if I hadn't just stood there, she said. Mizore choked out, "I'm sorry," between breaths. As her body became numb and insensitive to everything else, her frozen tears left stains on her cheeks. Her body appeared to get smaller as she wrapped her arms around her knees. She tried to hold it all in, her head buried deep in her hands. Her sobs were accompanied by a slow, rhythmic dragging sound that reverberated all around her. Her heart was in a similar fall to the sound of something falling roughly in front of her. She heard the same voice again. "Sorry for what, Mizore?" This time, though, she hesitantly looked up with blurry eyes as her heart recognized the voice, weak but soul-touching. She was able to identify an unruly mop of red hair with her wet eyes. She wiped her eyes angrily with her hands, not realizing the pain. She glanced again and saw his face. It was only for him that it accelerated her heartbeat and flooded her mind with emotion. She looked at his face in shock and incredulity. Her mind instantly conjured up the picture of his bloody body, and her gaze strayed to the side of his body. As she looked down, Naruto could see the terror in her eyes. The scene unfolding in front of Mizore brought back too many memories of the last time Naruto had abandoned her, causing her eyes to falter and her features to contort in fear. "Nar," she said in a thick, unfinished voice as her eyes met his thumb and forefinger gripping her chin and pushing her head up. His ocean blue eyes captivated her. The only difference between her feelings and those of a violent thunderstorm beneath a mirage was that she had lost the fantasy. She stopped breathing when she saw how naked his soul was. She could feel his eyes staring directly into her, and since her eyes were the windows to her soul, she was unable to move from them. He was able to see through all of her defenses and facades, both new and old, just as he had in the past. Even though they had been apart for years, he was still able to fully comprehend her, which gave her a sense of security as she felt vulnerable in front of him. He carefully avoided touching her wounds as his index finger moved over her face, gently scraping away her frozen tears. He muttered, "It will be all right, Mizore." It broke the proverbial dam with that. Appreciative that his clones were continuously depleting his energy, he discreetly placed a cool sucker in his mouth. He was able to conceal his suffering because the drain did not hurt as much as it would have if he had been at full power. As though to reassure herself that he wouldn't vanish, she squeezed him with her hands behind his back. As sobs tore through her fragile body, Naruto's unwounded hand moved gently to her neck to comfort her. He kept tracing light patterns on her back, suppressing a wince for her sake. As she squeezed, pain flashed through his body from his wound. The duration was uncertain and could have been either minutes or hours. On the snowy ground, they remained embraced. As she let go into him, her tears stained his shirt. All the pent-up anger, grief, and melancholy. Every night, she wondered what he would look like if she ever saw him again. She thought about him for hours on end, and every time he looked at her in a way that was unique to them, she felt feelings that were unknown but not unwanted. Then there were the times when she made him promise something, and he hoped that he would accept her and not despise her. As his own tears were released, his eyes had also begun to well up with tears. The number of times he had spent days working on a seal non-stop, motivated solely by her thoughts. Even though he had failed countless times, he always got back up and tried again, motivated only by the prospect of seeing her once more. His clones diligently carried out their duties, keeping the barrier in good condition, cutting the grass, and creating divided spaces inside it. Certain clones excavated holes, while others filled them in and drew seals inside. As safe as he could make it, the barrier would be secure. The arrival of the original was anticipated by another group of clones. 4 unique clones, the original and a girl, passed through the barrier in a matter of minutes. They managed to get the 2 inside the house safely while scrambling to complete their tasks as efficiently as possible. The girl entered a nearby room while the original entered a separate one. While the four remained, the clones dispersed to resume their tasks. Regretfully, Shadow Clone's shadow seals were hazardous. The consequences could be catastrophic if they were dispelled midway through seal's operation. After obtaining authentic materials, two of the clones began creating a beacon seal. The girl was attended to by the other two. One by one, they carefully raised her limbs and took off her bloody bandages. They had everything ready in a matter of minutes, and just in time. Abruptly, the door was pushed open. They had just a few seconds to position themselves. The room was filled with a subtle green glow. The slightest frown was on Miyuki's face. Her clothes were a little out of place, and her hair was disheveled. Her arms still had sleep marks on them. She muttered something about immature brats while intensifying her efforts to seal Mizore's wounds. Kazushi said, "You're losing your touch, brat." Naruto gave him a shady glance, and he rolled his eyes. The burning sensation of his wounds healing kept Naruto awake as he lay on his bed, despite his best efforts to fall asleep. His flesh and skin had already been sewn back together, so he appeared to be in good physical condition. Unfortunately, it takes a lot longer for bones to heal after damage. Not to mention the extreme strain on his muscles. At least his clones were okay, even though it would take the entire night for his bones to heal. In an attempt to find a more comfortable position, he moved in his bed once more. It obviously didn't work. He scowled briefly before turning to look at the wall. Only a faint candle on the nightstand illuminated the room. The gentle closing of a door informed him that his grandfather had departed. Get some sleep. But as the grating feeling his wound gave him returned, he silently cursed him in his mind. Nevertheless, he would make an effort. However, it did help to know that Kazushi would not be sleeping tonight either. To Kazushi's annoyance, Miyuki had convinced him to keep an eye on the two of them while she recovered her energy, even though Naruto's barrier would likely function perfectly. Kurumu. Sukune and his group charged through the nurse's office door, which flew open. Mocha looked at the numerous patches on the succubus and worriedly said, "Are you okay?" Yukari asked, "What happened?" as she struggled to get onto the bed due to her small stature. Then the two girls came to a halt, and then they both became irritated. At the moment, their crush was constantly checking on Kurumu, fussing over her wounds and asking her if she was alright. Where did they get irritated? Kurumu was eagerly taking it all in, and she was blushing shamelessly as a result. Kurumu waved her wand, and a big washtub materialized over her head. After a frustrated cry, Mocha and Sukune discovered that they were preventing an angry succubus from murdering the local witch. Kurumu then returned to bathing herself in Sukune's care, much to the chagrin of the witch and vampire. Luckily for all of them, Sukune still had some awareness of his surroundings. "Ah, Kurumu, what happened?" he asked, making every effort to sound serious. Fortunately, Kurumu appeared to be able to detect his slightly more man-ish voice. She temporarily set aside her boundless love for Sukune and allowed a puzzled expression to appear on her face. Her eyes were fixed on her covered legs as she said, "That's the thing. I'm not entirely sure myself." A few chills ran down everyone's spines when they heard, "You all know how Mizore's been missing for a few days, so I checked with our teachers and even the headmaster." Talking to the headmaster wasn't the most enjoyable experience. Many were hesitant to ask him for anything because of his constant smile and his eerie eyes, which were obscured by his hood. She let out a clumsy laugh before biting them hard. Then the new guy joined the class, and I decided to ask him if he knew anything. With an adamant whisper, Sukune exclaimed, "What, were you trying to get yourself killed?" Kurumu shifted her knees slightly and fiddled with her fingers. When Sukune felt a hand on his shoulder, he said, "I was trying to save Mizore," but his rage soon subsided. He shook his head and sighed a little in apology. Yukari had always been the more practical member of the group. "Kurumu, did you find anything?" She gazed expectantly at Kurumu with a stony expression on her face. She clenched her fists and ground her teeth, saying, "Tisk, that bastard is keeping Mizore locked up somewhere. Who knows what he's doing to her?" At least she seemed fully healed from what Kuyu did. Kurumu exclaimed, "He even somehow forced Mizore to fight me," as her leathery wings burst from her back, their veins pulsing with anger. Her face was taut as virtuous rage flared behind her eyes. "In fact, he couldn't even land a hit on me. All my wounds were because he made Mizore fight me," she said. "That's horrible," Mocha said in a horrified tone that was unusual for her. There had been a lot of strange and perverse boys at the school. What if that respectable facade had been a lie? She firmly grasped Sukune's hand and raised it to touch her rosary, clearing her mind of any negative thoughts. An unspoken message. This would involve her inner power and personality. He had no idea how long it had been. He was aware that the candle had already gone out and the room was dark. He was still awake, though. The results of his wound's relentless efforts. In a futile attempt to ease the agony, he twisted a little more. It obviously didn't work. A creaking sound. He moaned in his head. Even though his progress was minimal, he didn't need Kazushi to undo it in order to go back to sleep. With years of experience, he controlled his breathing and forced his body to relax. With a quiet thud, he chuckled to himself. I still have my touch. His body slanted slightly, interrupting his thought. His bed's pressure changed. His mind went into overdrive, and he used Yuki to slowly charge his limbs. He was free of the pressure now. In order to subdue and, if necessary, eliminate, he moved his legs subtly. Then he lost control of the situation. His back was gently nudged by something soft. His neck tingled with a light breath. Whatever was behind him tensed as he pulsed his energy once. The energy signature he recognized was Naruto? She asked in a shy, low voice. It was hardly audible to him. Additionally, it was rough and coarse, indicating that her sobs had caused soreness in her throat. That moment would determine every decision he made. He remained silent. Mizore calmed down in a matter of seconds. His thoughts were racing. What was happening? However, his body was moving at the opposite speed from his mind, which was moving at 1,000 miles per second. The burning pain from his wound stopped registering as soon as he felt the unconscious calming sensation. In a matter of seconds, exhaustion caught up with him. He had no idea when he had fallen asleep. All he would know would be that something had changed. He blinked the sleep from his eyes and stretched his body out. He noticed that it was already noon as he idly turned to look out the window. He snapped upright and frantically used his hands to wipe his eyes. He never slept until noon, even though it was already noon. He jumped up, sensing that something was wrong. He patted his side, but he was unable to determine what it was. It was true that his wound was healed, but something else felt off. He rolled his shoulders and muttered something about being overly tense before pausing in the middle. His brows furrowed. He realized he was relaxed as he stretched various parts of his body. The stiff, nearly mechanical movements he made every morning had stopped, and the knots in his muscles had disappeared. As he inhaled more deeply, the corners of his mouth pulled up a little. The world appeared slightly more optimistic than usual. Then, as he finally caught sight of it out of the corner of his eye, he paused. Spread out on his bed was a man with light purple hair. He swung around. Even so, he found himself retreating a little because reality was so much more real than fantasy. The purple-haired Yuki. Ona's head moved slightly as she stirred. Her blue orbs came into contact with the light as her eyelids slowly opened. As though looking for a missing source of warmth, her arm extended to her side. She rolled to her left when she found nothing but air. Then she saw another pair of blue eyes instead of the boy's sleeping body. Most of her attention was on what was in front of her, but a part of her was at risk of mimicking a tomato. Her hands instinctively reached out as her body appeared to glide to Naruto. Naruto, her purplish eyes trembled. Mizore, he leaned in to meet her, as did his body. She accelerated as she approached. Almost gracefully, she ran into Naruto. Her body was glued to his, her arms twisted tightly around him. She kept saying, "Don't let this be a dream, don't let this be a dream, don't let this be a dream," as her arms grew tighter around him. Her trembling eyes were slowly releasing tears. He had instinctively reached into his thigh pouch and put a sucker in his mouth. Even though he felt excruciating pain for a few seconds before it gradually subsided, the cost was worthwhile. As they embraced, Mizore's arms also lay behind his back. Salty water trickled down his cheeks as he laid his head on Mizore's. He responded by repeatedly shaking his head from side to side. It's not. It was meant to both validate Mizore's claim and allay his own similar anxieties. It's not. Naruto, why did that happen? As her voice broke, she asked herself why she was still unable to say it. The hug ended far too quickly. Shush, you don't have to say anything. Despite the fact that both of their eyes were red, their smiles conveyed their feelings. So, how have the past few years been? She had no idea how they had gotten into the kitchen. No, their connection had never been severed in the first place. They had reconnected. Both of them were unable to stop grinning for the longest time. Then again, Naruto burned himself while preparing breakfast. Even though Naruto's cry of pain was more of a natural reaction from his human side than real pain, she had jumped to his aid without hesitation. She was now prodding her breakfast with her chopsticks, but it appeared that she was doing so more to check its safety. Her laugh was like an angel's presence to him. Hey, sorry Mizore, I kind of forgot I can't cook. Only prepare ramen cups, and I already finished my stock yesterday, she said. She smiled sheepishly and said, that makes two of us then. Her laughter doubled when she heard Naruto's stomach growl, which was rather uncomfortable. Mizore said, well, the academy canteen sells nice food. There was no doubt. Naruto had already started to discard the food he had just prepared. Then Naruto's face lit up with a cunning grin. You might want to hold on, Mizore. He jumped in a moment when she raised an inquisitive eyebrow and was swiftly put on his back. Her hands automatically tightened around Naruto, who responded to her yelp with a playful laugh. Hey! Naruto was unaffected by her outraged reply. It was obvious that he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. Both of their faces were adorned with a gentle smile. She laid her head gently on his back and basked in his warmth. Her wounds were no longer important, and nothing else mattered. Naruto and Mizore were stopped in one of the school's hallways by a bespectacled individual wearing a black and white uniform. You are not supposed to be here, the person said. The interruption of their happy stroll caused them to both look at the man. He pushed his left side forward at the same moment, and 4 other officers in similar attire surrounded them. All students are to be in their dorms until further notice. Naruto watched in bewilderment, but Mizore was aware of what was going on because of the insignia they were all wearing. Mizore muttered, we have to leave. Instead, Naruto was releasing tiny amounts of chakra to gauge the threat level of his possible assailants. Those monsters were not sensitive to chakra and would not sense it because they only had Yuki. Mizore reached up to pull up her scarf, but the bespectacled man appeared to have noticed her gesture, causing him to grin cruelly at her. His 4 goons moved in closer, saying, Mizore Shirayuki. You have escaped persecution once, you shall not do again. The newest pupil questioned, under whose authority? The 5 men around them appeared to be infuriated by his question. How dare you insult the Public Safety Commission with your idiotic question? He exclaimed, lifting his left arm and quickly jabbing it up at Naruto's neck. But Naruto's speed was faster than his. Before his straight palm had even moved a few centimeters from its starting point, it was stopped. Naruto's fingers curled around his wrist, exerting tremendous pressure on it. He sent his other arm in alarm, signaling his lackeys to attack. He caught a glimpse of Mizore's transformation and the cold aura that enveloped her from his peripheral vision. He could still see the pain she was trying to conceal, though, as she moved with force and speed that her body was not yet ready for. He ducked in an instant, then shot off in Mizore's direction with a huge power boost. She was literally carried off her feet as soon as she fired an ice shard. As Naruto pulled her front into him, her shocked cry was muffled. He carefully removed the Yuki-onna from his body and asked, are you okay, Mizore? He supported her from the abrupt stop by putting his hands around her shoulders. She blinked to clear her eyes of the stars while slowly nodding her head and hugging her body with her arms. Naruto asked, who are they? 2 firm hands were placed on his shoulders, shocking him. Naruto was taken aback when Mizore said, promise me you will never mess with them, they're the Public Safety Commission and a corrupt form of militant enforcers for the school. Mizore's eyes had never been this emotional since she had forced him to make the promise the first time that evening. This time, though, the feeling was different. Rather than feeling warm, it felt chilly and overly serious. Mizore. His rational side told him. He was powerful, and from what he could tell, he was much more powerful than the PSC captain. It makes sense that the organization couldn't compete with him if its leaders were so incompetent. However, Mizore's level of vulnerability as she begged him caused him to think more than twice. Please, she pleaded in her mind, I don't want to lose you again. The strain on his shoulders grew. It was as clear as if she had spoken it normally, even though she had whispered it. Her arms fell limply to her sides as she said, don't worry about it, okay, Mizore? I won't cause problems with them. He made no promises. He sheepishly rubbed his stomach to emphasize his point and quickly deflect her attention. Hey, Mizore, I don't want to impose, but do you have food at your room? He asked. With a distressed smile, she merely nodded and began to move. He could almost feel the pulse in his veins. The helpful teacher in charge of the girls' dorm had been less than accommodating, and they had been stranded on the ground floor for 15 minutes. Listen, Ms. Jin, I'm a friend of Mizore, will you please let us pass? She repeated exactly what she had said the previous 11 times. Her yes, you know boys are not allowed here. Naruto turned away, ready to get off the ground. The teacher's smug expression was already beginning to take shape. Whispering, he leaned to his side. She shook her head slightly in response, but she couldn't help but laugh a little inside. Do you mind if I drop by through the window? She asked. Naruto had always been incredibly persistent. It felt weird to enter her room because the hallway was deserted, as if everyone else had heard about the PSC's house arrest. Days had passed since she had entered her room. Many items in the room had a light dust coating, and everything else was in its original location. Behind her, the door clicked shut. She was compelled to clean up because it would not be appropriate for Yuki Onna to live in a filthy place, especially when her significant other was there. Her inner annoyance returned as she was reminded of her shortcomings. She threw herself down next to her bed and reached for a book she knew well. For want of a better phrase, her diary was hers. It contained numerous private notes and drawings that were all manifestations of her emotions and ideas. Particularly the pocket in the back that contained extremely valuable letters. She reached for the bookmark while she was looking at the diary, but she stopped when her fingers lingered over the flap. There were two things that were separated by that particular bookmark. Her life in two stages. Following it, everything from the time she enrolled in Yukai Academy. Prior to it, everything from her early years, particularly a boy with yellow hair who turned red. In an attempt to forget Naruto, she had done her best to avoid anything prior to meeting Sukune. A new wave of guilt was brought on by this conclusion. How could she have acted in that manner? She had tried her hardest to forget Naruto, while he had been working day and night to try to find her again. Her hands gripped her diary tightly as she pulled her legs to her and hugged them. Her list of transgressions now included a new one. When Naruto learned, what would he do? He'd hate you, that's what. Despite her best efforts, she was unable to protect her thoughts from herself. Her arms stiffened as she said, "He'll never talk to you again." "I have to. No, I will tell Hi." Her diary vanished as soon as she heard the knock, and she quickly woke up. When she saw Naruto's face smudged onto the window glass, upside down, especially with the stick from the sucker in his mouth imprinted into his face, she chuckled quietly. She unlocked the window and wiped away a non-existent tear, thinking that he could always do this to her. She didn't see it coming, she couldn't prepare herself, she didn't have time to do so, and she was outside in a matter of seconds, crying in shock. She turned her body quickly, and was standing outside her window. Her terrified gaze lowered to discover that her feet were unsupported. She became aware of a squeezing sensation on her torso. Her weight was supported by two sturdy arms that were fastened around her waist. She only now realized that the ones holding her had her arms clamped around them. That one damning word from his lips, gotcha. Ironic humor caused her panic to subside. Her laughter was like silk in Naruto's ears. How was she able to forget? Naruto has always enjoyed pulling practical jokes. However, she was now unable to ignore the way her body pressed against Naruto's. With a level of control that few others possessed, Naruto channeled chakra to his back and used his clothing to make indirect contact with the wall. Even though the Yuki Onna should have felt cold, her presence felt warm. She seemed to be able to calm the anxiety that had been bothering him for years. Then, to Naruto's shame, his stomach chose to complete his practical joke with a humiliating conclusion. His own happy giggles echoed back at full volume, as did Mizore's. Mizore paused, holding her refrigerator door open and lowering her head slightly as she recalled why she had initially recommended the school canteen. Naruto, I only have cold food." "That's fine." After assisting her with a few dishes, they set the table a short while later. She had prepared all of the traditional Yuki Onna dishes, which were the only ones she was capable of making. However, Naruto was attempting to understand how cold food could smell so amazing. His nose was less than a centimeter from the food, and he crept closer as usual, attempting to fill his nostrils with the entire aroma. He detested having to release his breath now. Everyone who witnessed his antics, including a Yuki Onna who had just been tricked, usually laughed. Even though she blushed when she realized Naruto enjoyed her food, she was still able to sneak up behind him and place her mouth in a calculated way. Slowly, slowly, slowly. Naruto. The outcome was hilarious. He made a huge leap. His own strength occasionally worked against him. His piercing scream was cut off when his head struck the ceiling. There was a loud smack, and his body momentarily stopped in a funny way. Then it dropped directly onto Yuki Onna, who was laughing. Naruto blinked the stars out of his vision with a groan. After his hand soothed his aching head, he became aware of his situation. A flush was already rising from his betraying body. His legs were on either side of his body, which was straddling Mizore. Mizore strained to remove him from her. "Hey," she said. But it seemed more like she was having fun. A devilish grin appeared on his lips as he quickly realized what was going on. There appeared to be a tiny trace of fear in her eyes. Then he launched an assault. His hands went to key spots. He continued to attack even as her difficulties doubled. He restrains her disobedient arms above her head, giving up the tickling ability of his left hand. He pinned her swinging legs down by shifting his own. Unfortunately, her torso could only bend so much in an attempt to escape his ministrations. As Naruto rolled the sucker in his mouth to the side, giving his innocent face a playful and endearing hint, her laughter filled the room. "Give up. Surrender," he exclaimed, laughing as his right hand reached for the familiar spot directly beneath her arms. Her laughter increased in volume. She gasped out, "No," since she had no time to relax. His fingers applied light pressure to key spots as his hand moved up and down her side. The darker tone he used when he said the final sentence made her shudder. Give or else. She could only give Naruto a look that contained her response by lifting her neck. He abruptly stopped, leaving her perplexed. All she could see was the cross formed by his clasped hands. Although he didn't require hand signals, they did contribute to the effect. Shadow Clone Jutsu. A clone appeared as the smoke pillar next to him swiftly cleared. Her face was filled with pure, uncontrollable horror as she quickly realized the potential uses of this technique. Her renewed effort was quickly in vain, though, as the clone kneeled in front of the original and one of its hands secured her hands above her head. She made every effort to bend her waist, but it was in vain. The previous hand's tickling power was tripled as 3 hands moved over her body. The clone's hold was firm even though she tugged at her arms. Stop, she uttered barely between chuckles, but to her surprise, he didn't stop right away. Instead, she was the target of a playful yet almost cruel smile. 5. What? 4. She wasn't sure how much more she could handle. How could anyone be so mean? 3. 2. Had she been able to, she would have questioned how he was able to count so pathetically slowly. 1. A little bit more. 0. His agonizing hands came to a halt. She struggled to catch her breath, and her chest rose and fell quickly. Her clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin, and her hair stuck to her sweaty forehead. She heard Naruto's final laugh as he vanquished his clone. A captivating silence fell over them as they relaxed. His neck and back were hunched, allowing his eyes to meet hers. Their surroundings appeared to lose focus, and they could only see each other clearly. Mizore licked her own lips without realizing it as her gaze was drawn to Naruto's. They had no idea what was going on. It felt just right. But he had a nagging feeling in the back of his head that something wasn't right. He was merely a friend. She already had a boyfriend. However, their heads moved slowly, and their eyes and lips gradually drew nearer. They were never acquainted. The door to her room was abruptly thrown open. It signaled the arrival of a witch with a loud crash. Her breathing was labored, and her face was flushed. Her right hand was gripping her wand tightly, and her head was drenched in sweat. She started to say, "Mizore, I heard," but stopped when her gaze landed on the scene before her. Her initial response was to recoil backward and begin using every word in her vocabulary for disgusting things. She was far from senile, though. "You! Get away from Mizore, you creep!" she exclaimed, flicking her wand to make a big silver wash tub appear over Naruto's head. They reacted after being jolted out of their reverie. As soon as Naruto rolled to his side, Mizore hurled a shard of ice at the tub. The shard was broken and the tub was thrown off course by the clang it made with the tub. Naruto had already assisted Mizore in standing up in another second. Already, the witch was getting ready for her next wave. 3 washtubs larger than the first materialized over Naruto with a whirl. He caught the first 2 in a burst of speed that most people would never be able to. Then, with a graceful spin, one was aimed at the witch and the other back at the third. Yukari spawned several more washtubs in a moment of panic. The incoming projectile seemed to pass through all of them. Her tiny frame was propelled back towards the wall by the agonizing, forced expulsion of air from her lungs. Sadly, it appeared that she wasn't the only person in the room struck by the flying washtubs. Naruto instantly whirled his head in response to a second agonizing scream, just in time to witness Mizore collide with a wall while spinning a washtub against her chest. Her wounds flared up. As excruciating pain overtook her body, Mizore rolled into a ball. The situation was exacerbated by the addition of another person to the room. Kurumu unleashed her claws and ran at the red-haired boy after analyzing the situation in a few pivotal moments. But she didn't have an easy target this time. He slid his right foot behind him and leaned to his left as she swung her arm out. She hurled her other arm in his direction. He leaned back with his right foot behind him. Another move caused him to roll as his left leg flew over his right. "Stay still, bastard," she exclaimed as her leathery wings appeared and she flapped them, extending her claws' reach. She was shocked when her ostensibly simple opponent launched himself over her sweep after bracing an arm on the wall. Without hesitation, she followed suit. Expecting to see the boy's body pass beneath her fingernails in an instant, she kept her claw beneath her. She failed once more, and Naruto used chakra to firmly plant his left leg on the ground. The succubus's claws barely missed his abdomen as he pulled with the rest of his body until his body was flat on the ground. He hurled himself backwards to get some space and asked in a single breath, "What have I ever done to you?" "You know it's not me, bastard. I've seen what you've been doing to Mizore." She exhaled while attempting to stop her labored breathing. "What I've been doing?" Her arms were outstretched as she pointed to the room, Yukari, and then Mizore, saying, "We were fine before you came along. Now look what's happening." "She's my friend. I'm just trying to help her." "Does it look like you're helping?" "I don't know where you came from, but if you had been around for even a few months you'd know that she was perfectly happy with how she was." He thought, wah, and realized that she was somewhat correct. She had believed him dead for years, even though he and Mizore had been friends for all those years. She had already moved on from him and made new friends, hadn't she? He was overcome with guilt when she recalled how nearly he had forced Mizore to turn on her boyfriend. He lowered his arms and retreated a few terrified steps. Naruto. His entire body froze before turning to look at the person who had summoned him. Weakly, she extended her hand toward him. His eyes met hers. "Mizore, I don't know who he is or what he's doing here, but what I do know is ever since he came here we've been getting nothing but trouble. You realize this too, don't you? He's affecting you too. You haven't stalked Sukune even once today, not even tried to see him. You're not being yourself. Even with your injuries you would have tried, but you didn't. We're all worried about you. Sukune is worried." A portion of the succubus wanted to commit suicide if there had been fewer rivals. As she remembered what she could about Mizore's race, which, incidentally, shared some traits with her own, she reprimanded Mizore, asking, "Aren't Yuki Onna supposed to be loyal to their one true love?" Kurumu caught Mizore's attention as her very beliefs were called into question. In fact, who was it? As far as her tribe was concerned, she had already told her mother that she would marry Sukune, and her instinct told her that she shouldn't betray him. Her heart, however, disagreed with the customs of her people. Her hand fell lifelessly to the ground next to her, limply. As her hand struck the floor, Naruto felt her heart tighten. "Ikamai," then, was followed by a gentle gust of wind. The rushing air filled the void left by his departure from the room. He would require some time to reflect and remember. His stop was signaled by a tiny but swift swirl of wind. He had put a great deal of effort into that method. Every time he moved, his muscles protested, the sudden strain putting too much strain on his tissue. He made himself move slowly. Right foot forward, left foot forward, left foot forward. His arms hung limply by his sides, and his lower body appeared to drag his upper body forward. Miyuki's words died in her throat, "Where's I?" She stopped when she saw the icy despair in her grandson's eyes. He didn't even appear to notice her, but her eyes followed him around as he moved. "Naruto?" she inquired. Apparently, Naruto didn't hear. Below him, his feet continued to shuffle, almost in a robotic manner. "Naruto?" Naruto paused this time. His gaze slowly lifted to meet hers. Miyuki's breathing became labored. The expression on his face seemed off. It simply wasn't supposed to be on his face. Miyuki nearly cringed as she asked, "Is everything okay?" Naturally, things weren't going well. But for a brief moment, her grandson's eyes appeared to waver. Then he looked away and resumed his conversation. Her insides shivered at his soft, hesitant voice as he said, "Everything's fine." She turned to face her husband almost immediately after he left. They were still able to communicate even though Kazushi's expression stayed neutral. He didn't exactly know what he was saying, but she understood his silent message. There was always darkness at night. Everything below was obscured by the dark sky. The darkness overtook the life that was sleeping. But light also emerged from darkness. Because there wouldn't be any light without darkness. The diamonds that glittered far above, giving and promising. A set of blue eyes stared into the darkness. The still, peaceful night contrasted with the ferocious storm inside her eyes. Her gaze drifted to another outside the window. She instinctively fixed her gaze on a specific window. Behind that window slept a boy with brown eyes. His name didn't come to mind tonight, but for a brief moment, memories of their times together with the others flashed through her mind. Then her eyes moved without her even realizing it. Then they came to a halt. At a different window. Something deep inside her ordered her to do this. Her eyes gazed longingly and inquisitively. She was aware that it was his dorm room and that, if he had ever used it, he did so infrequently. But even so, it was sufficient to temporarily deceive her. As if he had never been here, she had looked everywhere. She had attempted to retrace their steps from his home, but she was unsuccessful. After forming a name, she softly rolled his name off her tongue. Her memories shot to the forefront of her consciousness. She was reliving them, not merely being remembered. Mizore. Mizore. Naruto yelled her name. His location behind a tree was clearly visible due to the gleam of his blonde hair in the early sunlight. She burst out laughing as Naruto awkwardly replaced the lollipop in his mouth after it had fallen out. With a "come" gesture on his hand, Naruto taunted her once more. She laughed with him as she ran off again, despite her labored breathing. "You missed," she cursed as her hand swiped down, barely missing him. She leapt to her right and back onto his tail while shifting her weight to one hand. They appeared to be moving in unison. His body twisted sharply in response to each jab of her hand. Naruto was at least a dozen meters away once more. His hand was taunting her again. She raised her head and crossed her hands together in a childish outburst. Even though she could see Naruto slowly approaching from her peripheral vision, she refused to look him in the eyes and kept her stance. The playful stretch of her name, Mizore, Mizore, nearly made her laugh, but she was adamant about getting her point across. She squared her shoulders and raised her head even higher, her face unwavering. She forced her breathing to slow. Now he stood directly in front of her, waving his hands to get her to move once more. Every few seconds, he uttered her name again, slightly altering the pronunciation each time. She hardly managed to maintain her expression of stoicism. The blood in her body surged through her system, and her heart pounded. She was waiting in her mind. A little bit more. A little more. Her hand tapped Naruto's and she was off, making a sudden, startling movement that Naruto never saw. "You're it, Naruto," he exclaimed, turning back to enjoy the brief moment. As she saw Naruto's shocked expression, complete with wide eyes staring at her in shock, she realized she had exactly what she wanted. But she didn't have time to do anything more. She gave a startled yelp and started running. She was closely followed by Naruto. She saw his hand just miss her hair as she twisted sharply. "No fair, Mizore," she exclaimed, blatantly ignoring him as she forced her legs to continue. Once more, she swerved her body just in time to miss his hand by a hair's breadth. Then she had a cunning idea. She abruptly stopped, tossing everything to the wind. She tried, figuring she could just duck and send Naruto flying over her. There was no time for her. They were launched into the air when his solid body collided with hers. Before stopping, they rolled on the ground multiple times. Naruto on top of her, the ground behind her. They looked into each other's eyes. Their eyes reflected each other's emotions and thoughts, making the outside world appear to blur. Even though their faces were only a few centimeters apart, they could feel each other's labored breathing. One by one, their chests rose and fell in rapid succession. Then, to her surprise, he vanished out of thin air. She raised her head and gazed incredulously at his vanishing shape. "Now you're it again, Mizore," he said in a tone that was almost mocking to her. She threw her legs under herself and started running after him again after he playfully laughed off her outraged cry. She laughed softly and without humor, almost losing her sense of self. A boy with red hair stood behind the set of windows she was staring at. He played absently with his red hair with his hand. He had never given his hair's color change a second thought, caused by his phoenix blood rising to a new level. At least he believed that the gold strands that were still present occasionally added contrast to his hair. It now felt more like a mark, a reminder of a previous stage and a new beginning. His own azure eyes gazed directly at Mizore through the window. He could see her, but she couldn't see him. He had the ability to willfully make his eyes detect light rays that were invisible to most others. He thought Kurumu might have a point. He had set aside time to observe and attempt to avoid Mizore for the time being. What would happen if it seemed that Mizore was better off without him? He had now left and arrived here. He was unsure of the cause of the unidentifiable, uncomfortable sensation that had nestled in his stomach. He was already aware that tonight would be a sleepless night. He was familiar with the sensation from his past. "Will someone kill me while I sleep?" Something gnawed at him so much that it prevented him from completely letting go and sleeping. "Who's going to grab my food?" It was much worse now. He was unable to even alter his course of thought. Suddenly, alcohol seemed to have an allure that he had never experienced before. He sat on the window ledge with his back against the wall and let out a silent sigh. Every now and then, weary eyes flickered to the night sky. Instinctively, he pulled a sucker from his thigh pouch. He braced himself and tossed it into his mouth to replace the one that had melted hours earlier. He forced his muscles to relax as much as he could, barely suppressing a small cry of pain. Night. The pain seemed to be much worse. He knew he would be anyhow, and he was right. He was already off, with no bags under his eyes from accumulated tolerance. She would be safe with 3 cloaked clones pursuing her. He felt the need to focus all of his energy on his projects for the time being. He shook his slightly malformed hand and bit back a curse. It appeared that he would suffer if he dismissed a shadow clone while it still contained nature energy. Additionally, he would absorb the clone's nature energy. He experimented with progressively less nature energy until his clones stopped turning to stone. Overexposure to nature energy appeared to cause his body to become deformed, ultimately transforming him into a stone statue. It was useless and there wasn't enough of it. He turned back to his room and rubbed his head wearily with his hands. He would need to take a break because nature energy also appeared to interfere with his ability to regulate his inner energies. It appeared to upset the equilibrium of his energies. It would probably blow up in his face if he tried to do anything right now. His hand hesitated, hovering over a seal. A storage seal that protected his most valuable items. He had read them over and over again until he could mentally recite every word. When he found himself doubting himself, he frequently did the same. He felt compelled to go farther tonight, to touch it. It had been years since he had done that. To reassure himself that they were still there, he longed to touch something. He struggled to keep his hands away, barely succeeding. He swiftly closed his eyes after ripping them from the seal. He doubted that he would be able to resist again. He threw away the pillow and groaned loudly as he stood up. Right now, he didn't want to think about anything, much less her. Right now, even going to class seemed much better. However, he would need to ask for a different class. He would stay, primarily for protection but also to gain more knowledge about the modern world. He stumbled to the kitchen, dragging his body tiredly. He was reminded of his regret almost immediately by the faint blue glow of the little moonlight that came into the kitchen. To evoke a mental image of Mizore, he held it and sucked in a lot of air. Then he released his grip, hoping that his problems would vanish like the air that shot out of him. No, they didn't. He sat clumsily on the floor, letting his body fall and sprawling in a haphazard manner. The wall supported his back. He gazed idly out the window at the swaying trees. He felt jealous tonight, jealous of those trees' ability to just sit around all day. The way they could just enjoy the cool wind and sway with it. The fact that they were not burdened with mental or emotional issues. There were times when things were just too difficult. He turns his head slightly mechanically and absently registers his grandfather's presence, saying, "You know, I never did quite believe in the saying that time heals everything." His grandfather, whose calm and orderly demeanor stood in stark contrast to Naruto's position, sat down next to him and said, "I've lived for some centuries, and I can easily tell you that there are some things that time alone doesn't heal." He held a small cup of his special brew and said, "It's not alcohol and it's certainly not any other vices either." He raised it to his coarse lips and took several sips. He could smell the strong tea scent and thought, they certainly help you delay it on the outside though, but they're still nothing but distractions that try to hide your real problems. Kazushi took his time, drinking his tea slowly while glancing at his grandson inconspicuously. His grandson rasped the words dryly, "Then what does?" He was offered another cup of tea, which he wrapped his hand around. Kazushi sipped slowly a few times. He had to remember to thank Miyuki once more because her kind and encouraging demeanor had already won him over a long time ago. It depends, from person to person. For me, it wasn't so much a thing as it was a person. Kazushi took his time, making sure that every word was understood. But I can say that trying to bury sorrows under more sorrows only makes it worse, and leaving it up to time is just darn lazy and useless. After taking several more sips of his tea, he stood up. Naruto had always been a survivor, so he would figure it out and get back up. Shizuka. Sensei. What happened to the new student? The feline instructor's expression briefly changed from one of shock to one of thoughtfulness. The class let out a number of disappointed groans. It seems that he applied to be transferred to another class. However, a tiny minority held radically different opinions. That coward. How could he flee? Kurumu could hardly contain her desire to go hunting and flash her claws. Her friend's thoughts were similar. He wouldn't get away so easily because he had caused one of them pain. When Sukune was reminded once more of Mizore's inability to attend class, his fists clenched. The class's muttering was instantly quieted when the teacher said, "Oh yeah. One more thing, the Public Safety Commission requests that every student gather at the school field after class." It was always more along the lines of, "Either do it or you will be punished," when the Public Safety Commission made a request. But hadn't Kuyu been relieved of his position? Lessons that day ended far too early. Students were already rushing into the school field. Even though it was 10 minutes early, probably because it appeared that the Public Safety Commission, PSC, was still in operation. Because every possible entrance and exit had 2 PSC members. The rest of the PSC appeared to be lined up on the stage, which had also been prepared, all of them fully uniformed. There was a single loud smack from the stage, and then there was silence. Even the faculty members in attendance appeared to focus entirely. Then the stage was abruptly filled with a tiny cloud of smoke. It cleared in a matter of seconds. At the front of the stage, facing the assembled audience, was a man with jet black hair wearing a white tuxedo. PSC members gathered around him, lending him a strong sense of authority. The students were frantically trying to think of ways to please their new head, and the atmosphere was tense as he spent a few minutes observing the crowd critically. He started with a serious expression. He spoke without assistance, but his loud voice seemed to come from everywhere. Members of Yuki Gakuen, in light of Kuyu's demise due to him being unfit to maintain justice in Yuki Gakuen, I am taking over the Public Safety Commission. I am Masahiro, the new Grand Master of the Public Safety Commission. A figure in priest robes emerged, followed by softly patterned footsteps. As a sign that the PSC will not be what it once was, the PSC shall officially work with the headmaster to ensure that justice is done in this school. A few seconds later, there was cheering. Students and teachers gave tentative applause, indicating their uncertain support, more than a few clubs did. Kuyu always looked for new ways to push himself, but he had never collaborated with the headmaster in public. There were still some people who were more than skeptical, but many people had the idea that perhaps the PSC was improving. What would this new agreement accomplish if the headmaster, with all his authority, had no trouble allowing Kuyu to do everything he had done? Aaa, with her eyes fixed on a random spot in front of her and her bow staff still held evenly and perpendicular to the floor, the red-haired girl suddenly snapped to attention and said, "Deshi." The form was picture perfect. It kept repeating in her mind. She had completely expected to see him beaten, if not killed, when a stranger simply marched up to the PSC headquarters. Following Kuyu's hospitalization, she and Kido had been working diligently to clean up the mess that had fallen. The situation worsened when they learned a few hours ago that all of their student and PSC member data had been compromised. That was extremely concerning because Kuyu's room was protected by a strong barrier that only he was supposed to be able to access information about PSC personnel. Kuyu's other two captains were attempting to bolster their power in the vicinity of the school. Kido had already gone to deal with the intruder because he was the more bloodthirsty of the two. Kido had a propensity to play with her food, and a tiny, hidden part of her felt sorry for whoever it was. She only felt his attack from the sidelines after swiftly turning her focus away from the stranger. That and the severed spider leg that had unexpectedly landed on her desk. When she saw the new color that the PSC headquarters floor and walls had taken, she jumped back and barely suppressed a short scream. Nearly every PSC member in the room, particularly those who had attempted to interact with the stranger, contributed to the new red hue. A shiver ran up her spine as she locked eyes with the stranger. The intruder's icy, hard eyes appeared calculating and unbreakable. She tapped her bow staff on the floor several times, steeling her nerves. Then, expecting a group of PSC officers to follow her, she had attacked the enemy. The stranger's amused expression had escaped her notice. She swung down hard after channeling enormous amounts of Yuki into her bow staff. There was never the satisfying crunch of a bone in her victim. Instead, a single outstretched arm held back her staff, causing her eyes to widen in shock. She attempted to tear the staff from him by twisting her arm, but it seemed to have been adhered to his hand like glue. She briefly became terrified and threw out her right leg, aiming it directly at his face. But before she could rip her staff from his hands with her weight in his face, a searing pain shot through her leg. Her right leg landed hard on the ground, causing a bruise to quickly form just above her ankle, and she fell onto her left knee. She let out a short, clipped scream in another second as her bow staff was torn from her hands and fell onto her left forearm under his power. Her tiny body was flung to the ground, where she struggled desperately to stand up. Her right hand twisted around the blue-black spot as she leaned slightly to one side in an attempt to calm the throbbing pain. Her dilated, terrified eyes gazed up at his cold eyes. His slight, amused smile only increased the danger of his presence. Her fingers were beginning to clammy, and her breathing was shallow. She got ready to run as far away as she could by streaming Yuki into her legs. Kuyu was nothing compared to this creature. Her muscles stiffened as adrenaline surged through her body, prepared to explode all at once. As her body prepared to fly, her eyes had already lost focus. Then, instead, her body leapt, wasting everything. When a finger was put to her lips, a scream didn't even escape. The taller creature's eyes met hers, and her pounding heart thundered in her ears. She couldn't tell what kind of smile he had on his face, so she wasn't sure if she should be happy. Running away was not an option with his hand firmly on her left shoulder. He made a "come here" motion with his left hand. Behind her came the hesitating, heavy footsteps of the few other people in the room. She counted the number of pairs of footsteps heard as a habit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. There was nothing left but her personal squad. The first attack had killed everyone else. She had a mental scream at that realization. To get her attention, he waved his hand in front of her as though he could sense her distress. He allowed a gentle and comforting smile to appear on his face as her gaze was directed onto his. He had knelt before her. Then, as the room's doors flew open and a flood of PSC members poured in, her entire body jumped once more. His smile remained unwavering. He held her bow staff in one hand and said, "You don't mind if I borrow this for a bit, will you?" She shook her head timidly in quick, desperate motions. His other hand then landed softly on her head. He gently stopped her trembling, then gave her a head pat as if she were a young child. He said, "Stay here and don't go anywhere else, okay?" in a kind and gentle manner, as though they had known one another for a long time. Somehow, she felt a little more at ease. His smile grew as he acknowledged her response with a simple nod. He was gone in an instant, and she lay there for a few seconds not knowing what had happened. Her absent-minded but perplexed gaze met the many perplexed looks of the other PSC members who had hurried in. Then it began, a white flash, and the room's doors were sealed. Before anyone could even jump in disbelief, the first blow was delivered. A muscular member's body left an imprint on a wall after being flung wildly at it. The stranger remained in the attacking stance, in front of his hunched arms, her bow staff held evenly. Then another member was thrown to the ground, and he vanished once more. She made a note of how he had prevented their deaths, but her logical mind was still in disbelief at the strength and speed of her possible assailant. She saw her staff being twirled around in a flurry of precise, fluid movements, but she also noticed that the stranger's form was still more than picture perfect, even though there were a few awkward stances and positions. 3 more members were hurled in the direction of the door by a sudden outward lash of her staff. Her rational mind was on the verge of going crazy when a brief blue screen flashed when they struck the door, indicating that a barrier had been erected and there was no way out. Every member who had hurried in was either face down on the ground unconscious or in a heap against a room wall when it ended in less than a minute. Then he was back in front of her, not even breathing heavily, and there was not a single visible scratch on him. He appeared to offer her her bow staff as he carefully raised it to her. She was afraid of her own staff in his hands, but she didn't seem to notice. When he put his hand around hers, a flinch went through her. She dared not look at what he was doing because it didn't seem possible to look away from him for even a moment. He left it in her hands as her fingers instinctively clasped around her bow staff, sensing its familiar texture. A tiny sense of comfort emerged from within her almost instantly. With a nod of chilling fear and bubbling anxiety, she asked, "Now, why don't we have a nice chat?" Deshi. She blinked her eyes once more before quickly turning to face Masahiro. She flinched at the strain on her right leg. "Do you think that my speech was apt?" She answered right away, "Yes, sir." Her response was well practiced from working with Kuyu for so long. His sighs set off alarms in her mind. Had he not liked her? "Deshi, I'm not asking for a servant." His monotonous statement confused her, but she dared not challenge anything her superior said. Kuyu had given her a lot of thought, and here was someone who was equally, if not more, powerful than Kuyu. She couldn't understand another sigh from his sadly amused face, which only caused her to become afraid. To keep her legs from shaking, she tensed them as much as she could. At the same moment as he did, her body reminded her, "Do your injuries still hurt?" "No, sir." Kuyu's subordinates would have quickly discovered that weakness was eliminated. With a keen eye, Masahiro chose to repair some of the harm caused by Kuyu, even as he sighed once more at the poor girl's well-trained reactions. Given that he had done this far too often in the past, it was easy to see how she was attempting to conceal her suffering. As Masahiro got closer, Deshi thought about running more than once every few seconds. Then, as a brother would, he put his hand on her shoulder, leaving her bewildered once more. An amused smile appeared on Masahiro's face, and she became concerned, particularly when his eyes appeared to glint and conceal something. Abruptly, she was carried in bridal style and lifted into the air, causing her to yell. She opened her mouth to protest, but Masahiro interrupted her before she could say anything. She was insulted by the rhetorical question, "Do you know how obvious to me it is that you're hiding your pain?" But she had neither a response nor a rebuttal. "Just stay still, all right?" he asked in a light-hearted manner, masking but not eliminating the worry in his query. Yes sir." She didn't understand what she was saying. "And stop attaching, sir, to the back every time you talk to me, okay?" Respect for authority had always been instilled in her, particularly with Kuyu. She did not, however, neglect to respond. She muttered, "Okay," more than anything else, but it was enough. She was pressed against him and was unable to resist soaking up the warmth. The last time someone had held her with such familiarity, she could hardly recall. She nearly jumped in surprise. When had they moved? She had been put on a bed by him. Her stomach began to grow uneasy. She had always been aware that Kuyu occasionally slept with girls, and that the women he slept with were never the same. In fact, they frequently lost their capacity to become mothers. Her limbs twisted around her like lightning, rearing primitive instincts in her. Her terrified gaze followed Masahiro around. Kuyu's fate was sealed when Masahiro saw the way she behaved. The irony that Kuyu, a fire-type Yuki, would perish from the very thing he used and felt secure in was already apparent to him. Compared to some of the other fires in the world, even his kitsune flames were insignificant. She contracted her arms around her knees and shrank in size as he approached. Satisfied with his strategy, he took a seat on the bed. Deshi. Her terrified gaze remained fixed on him, exhausted by his every action. She had already moved back on the bed as far as she could. She didn't seem to react when I said, "I'm not going to hurt you. Just relax, okay?" He raised his hand in a mental sigh. Squeezing her eyes shut too quickly, she attempted to blend in with the wall. His hand grabbed hers as she began to scream. Then he put his other hand around her and on her other shoulder. A hug was given to Dashiko Deshi. Her hands attempted to push him away, but they were not as strong as his. He spoke softly, and she heard it faintly. As her body's energy stores ran out, her panicked mind gradually became calmer. She blinked angrily, a few tears streaming down her cheeks. She was attempting to bury herself in him now rather than the wall. She hardly resisted his actions after the hug was over. He applied a thin layer of healing ointment to her forearm while holding her left arm tenderly. He applied the medication carefully, dabbing lightly and drawing circles on her skin. Then he glided over to her right calf. Dashi's senses were lulled by the sensations her superior brought, and she found herself falling asleep. Even though he was merely administering medication, his manner was more akin to a kind message. His palm messaged away bruises and sore muscles, and his skillful fingers squeezed specific points just right. Unbeknownst to her, she had fallen asleep without the typical issues and anxieties consuming her mind. Her features were at ease, and her youthful innocence was evident for the first time since she joined the PSC. Masahiro didn't finish for 10 minutes. He had a manila folder in his hand as he sat on a chair next to her bed. He was now going over the parts about Dashi's past, what Kuyu had done to her, and what he had been planning again because it was his file. There was far too much silence in the room for anything to break through. As Miyuki treated her wounds, Mizore lay on her bed, clumsily trying not to move. After Miyuki's first 20 minutes of health warnings and lectures about her carelessness, the tension they had been able to temporarily ignore returned. Her medical supplies were all here, so Miyuki had essentially dragged her here, which was the only reason she was at Naruto's house. Since that night 3 nights ago, she had not yet met Naruto. She was certain that he wasn't present even now, while she was in his home. Although a part of her was sad and longed to see him again, she had largely succeeded in persuading herself otherwise. After all, perhaps she could resume her routine if she and Naruto never crossed paths again. Her typical routine, which used to make her happy, involved consuming excessive amounts of sukune. It would undoubtedly do so once more, wouldn't it? Even though, so Mizore, how has school here been? Seemed like a predetermined question. They both enjoyed the break in silence. She had gone on numerous adventures with Sukune and the others, saying, "It's been exciting and interesting." A few memories came back to her, and the smallest of smiles tugged at her lips. She was unable to contain her desire to say more. Long periods of silence cause a lot of thoughts to back up. Then everything rushes out one day when you do get a chance. Miraculously, she went above and beyond her normal self to share stories with Miyuki. Neither of them ever mentioned anything that worried Naruto. They had some similar ideas and thoughts, and they laughed and giggled a little. However, what appeared to be a harmless inquiry evolved into something more. The brief reminder of her age caused her to pause. "You're 16 years old now, right, Mizore?" she asked. Wasn't she 16 by now? The next time she turned 17, she would have her Snow White ceremony. In the eyes of her people, she was getting married. Her first thought was of Sukune, and she tried, really tried. However, her mind had strayed from her goal, and that night returned in a matter of seconds. She sort of proposed to Naruto that night. It didn't matter that he was unaware because she had subtly proposed to him. Deep within her, a surge of emotion equal to the naive happiness she experienced that night swept through her. But this time, the majority of the feelings were grief. Miyuki winced at the range of emotions that appeared on her face. Then, watching all of her hard work go to waste, she just sighed. There wouldn't be much use in wasting any more time on unnecessary details. She seemed to be telling herself, sometimes, problems are best dealt with directly. Miyuki fumbled for the right words, saying, Naruto and you have been apart for years. The two of you may have been very close friends in the past, but time changes things. I've been alive for a long time, Mizore, I would know. However, I'm not saying that all that time with Naruto was pointless and gone. No, in fact a bond like that doesn't just go away. Cluttered and even possibly hidden, but bonds like the one you and Naruto shared and still share don't just go away. By this point, she had completed her daily healing treatment. Miyuki's gaze was fixed on Mizore's, closely observing hers. If Miyuki had to continue to handle their emotional issues, she might feel like she was getting very old. I'm also not telling you to rush into things either. Take the time to think, to clear things up. But never forget that time doesn't wait for any one person. She lowered herself to Mizore's eye level and set aside her concerns about growing old. She whispered, sometimes, when people really care for something, they try too hard, and walked away, abandoning Mizore to deal with her emotional turmoil. Certain tasks must occasionally be completed alone. As she went over her daughter's most recent letter, Sarera's worried voice said, I'm still not sure, Miyuki. She had been with Surara for an hour when she said, trust me on this. Surara did not answer, and she continued to focus on the letter, so she sighed again. This place has been very pleasant. I've already made friends, as I mentioned in my previous letter, but this time I believe I've finally found the person I'm going to the Snow White ceremony with. I've been dating him for a few weeks now, and his name is Sukune Aono. When she first read the letter, she knew something was wrong. It appeared that her suspicions were now being validated. He is kind and pleasant, and even though I'm not sure how I feel about him yet, I'm confident that it won't be an issue. However, there are two other bothersome girls who persistently attempt to take him away from me. Even though her daughter's words were written down, there was something missing. It was obvious to her now that it was feeling. When Mizore wrote the letter, it was almost as if she was attempting to persuade herself. The remainder of the letter was too painful for Surara to read. There were too many things that could go wrong if nothing was done. What was she supposed to do? Surara, did you receive the notice about the bring your parents to school day? She appeared stunned for a moment after being startled out of her reverie. Her mind then returned to its earlier ideas, this time including the bring your parents day, and she nodded absently. If the entire mess was not resolved by then, perhaps she would personally resolve it. Miyuki appeared to be fighting the very strong desire to take drastic action, particularly when her efforts only succeeded in momentarily preventing Surara from interfering. But since she was a mother herself, she could relate to her. Personally, though, Miyuki was certain that the two needed to work out their current issue together. Perhaps they could offer some advice and insights along the way, but in her experience, this was one of the things they had to work out on their own. Perhaps whatever resulted from that would be for the better if their bond was not strong enough to withstand this. 3 screams of fear reverberated through the corridor. 3 forms were immediately launched into the air after that. One is large horizontally, another has a very long neck, and the third has a head that resembles an umbrella. 2 groups of PSC Commission members surrounded them and declared, the fan club coalition is of today disbanded. The 8 officers had PSC armbands around their left arms and were all dressed in matching black. A low moan of pain came from the pile. Why? This club has been disbanded as after a thorough investigation we have come to the conclusion that the club is useless and pointless. Any further resistance will be met with harsher consequences. As a group of students gathered around, murmurs began to spread. Many people had already begun to express concern that the new PSC Grandmaster would resemble Kuyu. Others applauded his choice to dissolve the coalition of fan clubs. In all honesty, it was just a small group of mentally ill teenagers with unhealthy obsessions over specific schoolgirls, consisting of just 3 members. The 2 squads turned and marched down to their next point of interest in rehearsed movements without saying anything to the student body. Masahiro had successfully restructured the entire PSC under their new direction, easily crushing any stupid opposition. Based on his observations and the information he found in their files, he swiftly assigned members to various roles after gaining the support of the majority of senior officers. Although Kuyu's fate was never discussed, nearly everyone was certain that he had been eliminated. However, it was known that 3 of Kuyu's 4 captains had been slain, along with any loyalists. Dashiko Deshi was the only one remaining, and it was easy to observe how Masahiro was transforming her. The 2 squads were assigned to carry out the decisions made following in-depth investigations and conclusions under the new PSC system. They were a part of the PSC division responsible for managing school clubs. The squads halted abruptly, eyeing the assembled crowd. Many of the students in the immediate vicinity held their breath unconsciously, causing them to freeze. Nobody even moved an inch. The front runner then introduced himself. Tamao Ichinos. The crowd quickly divided in a panic. Silence ensued as a student with turquoise hair stood by himself. PSC members picking on individuals was never a good thing. You are the head of the swimming club, correct? Yes, her heart pounded. Would she be taken into custody? She thought they had forgotten when they failed to show up yesterday to pick up the club payments, but now she was trying to keep her knees from trembling. She rarely felt afraid of attention. Instead, she enjoyed it and frequently used it to draw in food. However, the stares she received from the other students made her feel like a little child once more. She could see that several of them had condescending faces, but the majority of them were dominated by pity. Why were you absent from the club leaders' meeting yesterday? Is likely the reason why nobody showed up to pick up her money yesterday. She wetted her dry lips and reluctantly shuffled her right leg backwards, saying, I wasn't informed of any meetings. Many students were shocked and wide-eyed when they heard the statement. Understood. We shall check the messaging system then. Since when did the PSC actually accept excuses? Their bodies instinctively parted to let the two squads go, but their minds were currently short-circuiting. There is another meeting today at 1600 hours at the Public Safety Commission headquarters. Do not be late. Their expressions remained fixed in a state of pure, unadulterated shock. Let it be noted that this was the first time a typical student had encountered the PSC in this way without getting even a scratch or a threat. Like many others, she looked around anxiously. Ultimately, they were typically escorted by PSC officers, and most of the time they visited the PSC headquarters against their will. They couldn't understand why they were going to the PSC headquarters when not a single officer was dragging them there. Around her, she could see the heads of numerous other clubs. The newspaper club, the art club, the acupuncture club, and numerous others. She didn't seem to be the only person who missed yesterday's meeting. Her expression was just one of many that showed uncertainty, fear, and confusion. Suddenly, even sets of footsteps echoed, drawing their entire focus to the gates. When the gates were opened, two perfect lines of PSC members formed a direct route to the main building. The only club at the school with its own buildings and facilities was the PSC. She edged closer, testing her steps gingerly. There was no reaction from any of the PSC members. It appeared from looking around that the other leaders were hesitant as well. Before long, two unique and dissimilar footsteps were heard. Masahiro approached them wearing a black formal tuxedo. Most people would be impressed by his graceful gait and fluid steps. In an attempt to further confuse them, he made a brief bow of respect. Together with the others, she reluctantly bowed down. She caught a glimpse of a werewolf who had declined to bow out of the corner of her eye. His hands were jammed into his pockets as he stood. Leaning to one side, Jin cast a suspicious glance at Masahiro. Masahiro did not show it if he had noticed and taken offense. His voice complemented his confident and powerful posture as he said, "Welcome, student leaders. Please come in." He pointed to the PSC headquarters doors with his right hand. Masahiro, who was in the front, gestured Tamao toward the door. As they cautiously made their way to the doors, she led the others in hesitant steps while they kept their eyes on the PSC members lining their route, expecting them to leap and attack at any moment. Their bodies were tense, prepared to turn and flee at any moment, and their steps were light. To their surprise, one of many lately, they arrived at the meeting room with little difficulty. There were undoubtedly 30 of them, each of whom represented a different school club. Masahiro stood at the end of the table, with Dashiko Deshi to his right. The redhead wore a long, gray dress with white trim around the edges. The dress hung down to her knees, and the sleeves reached her wrists. There was a slit for mobility up to her thigh beneath one fold. Beside her, her staff was held at a perfect angle to the floor. He bowed slightly and took a seat, followed by all the other leaders in the room. Now that we're all here, I officially thank all of you for coming. Refreshments will be served after an hour and light snacks are available upon request. The room fell silent for a few seconds, with not a single sound coming from anyone. Then Masahiro succeeded in shocking everyone once more. He motioned for Deshi to occupy the vacant seat next to him. The PSC was not conducted in this manner. Kuyu's method was far superior. Since she was just as shocked as the others, it appears that his captain had also missed yesterday's meeting. She moved tiredly and uneasily as she sat down, her discomfort visible as she looked at Masahiro every now and then. She sat on the edge of her seat, her body stiff and rigid. She kept her head down and her hands firmly on her knees. Someone breathed next to her, and her entire body leapt. He whispered softly, "Relax." Her nerves were still tense, but they had been somewhat calmed. Today, I would like to discuss a few issues pertaining to how clubs are run in this school. First of which are the tributes which many of you pay. More than half of the people at the table began fumbling for their wallets as soon as he finished speaking. He went on, ignoring their presumptions and muttering complaints. His emphasis made it obvious to everyone that he was aware of the true nature of the protection fees. There will no longer be such protection fees. Then, to his hidden astonishment, his captain appeared to attempt to make her point. Before she could finish, she caught herself saying, but, and quickly looked away to avoid making direct eye contact with Masahiro. How could she have allowed it to happen? She cursed herself. Her breathing became labored as Masahiro and the other people at the table stared at her. If you have a point, speak up and say it clearly. As she chewed, her hands pressed against her thighs and her lips were pulled into her mouth. Without funds, how will the Public Safety Commission run? At most, our reserves will only last us a year. This was her belief every time she was dispatched to collect money. Oh. Masahiro appeared to take a moment to reflect. In response to his rhetorical question, her facial muscles twisted into a perplexed expression. Kuyu never told you about it, did he? She asked. His voice was filled with disgust as he spat out, I checked our funding personally yesterday. It turns out that the Public Safety Commission receives a generous amount of funding from the school every month. However, this amount has never been used, instead I found it in Kuyu's personal room. She fidgeted on her seat, staring at her own hands. Masahiro sighed and put a comforting hand on her shoulder as she slid out of her seat even more. I like subordinates who question their superiors' decisions. It helps keep the people in charge in line, so don't worry about questioning my decisions. His friendly grin served its purpose. Her head jerked up to meet his, and after a brief pause, she gave him a firm nod. Leaning forward to confront his astonished audience, he repositioned himself in his seat and clasped his hands in front of him. He took out a list while blatantly ignoring their looks, which showed unfathomable levels of disbelief. Using a pen, he drearily crossed off the first item on the list, which contained a few dozen more items to talk about. A week had passed. Naruto appeared to have never been here. While walking with her friends, Mizore's focus was diverted from the actual conversation they were having. What did they say? Cookies, Kurumu, Sukune, and Mocha. She decided it didn't really matter. She sighed silently and rolled her shoulders, taking in her surroundings. The sun was still high above them even though the long school day was coming to an end. At times, she found that time moved far too slowly. With all her strength, she forced her thoughts back to the boy in front of her, even though they were on the verge of returning to Naruto. It would be too tired to think about Naruto, she told herself. She could at least keep her thoughts on Sukune. After navigating a series of standard hallways, they finally arrived at the club room. They couldn't resist taking another look as they walked in. Jin? When did their accountable club leader truly arrive ahead of everyone else? His tone and furrowed brow conveyed his frustration, but it was still the most composed they had ever seen him. Not exactly, since they had chosen to confront the PSC, but it was more than enough to make them all realize how serious the situation was. Shut up. Just sit down, I have important news. He waited for them to nod before asking, you all heard about the change in the PSC, right? I was called for more than a few meetings since then, and it appears that PSC really is changing, but we can't be too sure. Their new leader, Masahiro, appears to be much better than Kuyu, but... He appeared to be trying to think for a moment. He continued with a slight lip suck. He concluded by saying, he's dangerous. Because it was emphasized and used alone, the one word that described everything became more pronounced. He had shadowy, dark eyes. He went on after noticing his members' curious looks. Masahiro, while he seems very nice and kind, I can tell from the way he carries himself that he's hiding things. From his controlled posture it's obvious that he has got self-control in spades. Unlike Kuyu. He took a moment to reflect. The others were concerned that Masahiro might be another Kuyu, but more subtle and crafty. In fact, his eyes are very guarded, and I mean very guarded. I couldn't read him at all. Not even a bit. The worst part, though, was when one of the other leaders did something he didn't like. When Matada challenged him, when he tried to attack Masahiro, just for that split second I felt it. He had moved faster than I could follow, faster than I probably ever will, and in an instant he had his hand on Matada's. We all heard the crack from his hand as Masahiro broke his wrist without even trying. But, Yukari interrupted him, expressing her surprise. She'd summarized everyone's thoughts with ease. Matada is an Earth-type Yukai and an armor-based one at that. To break through his skin and bone with brute force alone, it shouldn't be possible. But she realized that wasn't all when she looked into Jinei's eyes. But that wasn't the scary thing. It was during that split second when he released some of his power. It felt like I was looking at death itself. His power was like a tsunami compared to Kuyu. I couldn't even feel the end of it, and it wasn't even directed at me. His pale complexion and beads of sweat on his face gave the others the impression that he was afraid. Sukune looked to his club leader and asked hesitantly, "So what do we do?" Jinne thought and gulped audibly. "For now, we just do what he usually do. Masahiro hasn't tried anything funny yet, and everything he has done till now agrees with what he had said that day with the headmaster. The only thing he mentioned specifically to me was that, if we came across any information that may threaten peace in the school, we are to report to him first for investigation." They had to exercise caution now. Masahiro had made it very evident that their reports were being watched. Since the PSC now had control over the media, they would need to exercise much greater caution going forward. They were given no time, likely because Jin recalled the last time he had warned them not to oppose the PSC. He swiftly pushed them all out of the room and instructed them not to return until the following week. "One more thing. There won't be club activities for the rest of the week and today. Masahiro wants every club to inform the PSC of how they operate before we continue with club activities." Kurumu cursed Jin, rubbed her aching butt, and got herself up as ladylike as she could. While Sukune was a little confused by what had just transpired, Mocha shook her head to get rid of some of the stars that were flying around in her vision. Mizore just observed from a distance. When Kurumu grabbed Sukune's arm and angrily pushed Mocha out of the picture, she said, "That bastard doesn't know how to treat a lady. Unlike my Sukune." In keeping with her Yuki Onna ancestry, Mizore threw a sizable piece of ice at the succubus. She allowed a tiny smile to appear, ignoring the succubus's loud protest. "But in the back of my mind, something was lacking." She dismissed that idea as she glided toward Sukune and took hold of his other arm. Then, using their mutual love interest as the rope and prize, they played tug of war. Regretfully, one person was not amused. There were two agonizing bangs. The first hit Kurumu, knocking her off Sukune, and Mizore, expecting the attack, hurried to the side. Sadly for Sukune, he had been reduced to an innocent war victim. There was a loud, resounding bang as the big silver washtub fell on his head. As she hurried to tend to Sukune, Mocha let out a worried cry. Yukari only gave Sukune a frantic apology before focusing her attacks on a particular girl with purple hair. "Look at what you did to Sukune, Mizore," she said stoically, dismissing the charge with ease. Says the tiny dwarf that made the washtub. Despite her icy tone, the witch persisted in her desire to exact revenge on Sukune. She raised her wand and channeled energy through it while running on her short legs. A self-contained smile spread across Yukari's face as washtubs sprang up in quick succession. To her annoyance, however, the Yuki Onna appeared to effortlessly navigate each obstacle while sporting a playful smile on her arrogant face. She prepared one of her own projectiles and fired it at the witch, who made a hilarious attempt to avoid it. Just in front of Kurumu, another ice shard struck, preventing her from reaching Sukune and causing yet another cry of indignation and annoyance. The world appeared to be returning to normal at that precise moment, and she tried to believe that perhaps things could return to normal. He had already benefited many times from the fact that whatever his clones went through came back to him. It had enabled him to advance his sealing expertise to an unprecedented degree. Even Kazushi, who had spent at least 1,000 years studying seals, acknowledged that Naruto had outperformed him in the field. He was therefore somewhat appreciative of the method. In fact, it was probably one of the best tools he would ever need. But occasionally, he simply detested some parts of the method. For instance, when his clones dispelled his thoughts and feelings, they would also cloud his, unless he developed a very high level of mental control. Anger and frustration were among the last things he needed at the moment. He landed roughly on the ground and crossed his legs like a lotus. He then calmed down after balancing his arms and weight. He tried to clear his head by taking deliberate breaths, to even out the rapids flow, which rushed and made everything in his head hazy. No matter how hard he tried, he could only do so much to calm a raging river. As another group of clones vanished, his eyebrows furrowed. He sighed in frustration as he painfully slowly reviewed the memories. What was he to say about them? Uninteresting, traditional, or conventional? Throughout the day, he had not encountered a single novel concept. How did he get so normal? He stopped. He kept repeating the word to himself until he realized, with increasing horror, what was wrong with him. He had been normal for a whole week. He had never used that word before, but now he was using it. Had it disappeared? He spread his legs wide and rubbed his aching head. He was not making any progress, so it would be useless for him to continue. His eyebrow twitched animatedly as he gazed at the expanding stack of statues, sparing a glance to his right. There had been a dozen at the beginning, perhaps 2 dozen. However, it had already filled a pit, which he was certain could hold 1,000 or more. He laughed, perhaps amused, on some level. At least a tiny part of him was still not normal. He stood up warily and went to find a place to decompress. He was drawn to the soft splashing of water below. Water was a really fascinating thing. It was powerful and intimidating, capable of destroying anything in its path, including tsunamis. It patiently and persistently eroded rocks and buildings over millions of years. However, it was also a force that gave life, allowing it to flourish and create stunning beaches. The ability to change, however, was its most lovely feature. It never had a single form, it was constantly flowing, changing, and evolving. For years, it circumvented challenges until it finally wore it down. Here, the Red Sea had no effect. Everything remained the same. In a hole he had dug out on the hillside, he lay on the chilly floor. His ears were trained on the tranquil sounds of nature, and his eyes were fixed on the horizon. Simpler things in life can sometimes have the biggest impact. At least his mind was free of thoughts, even though it was still empty and unclear. However, often a person's mind tends to drift, and his was no exception. His memories played in front of him as his mind revisited old experiences. A pensive expression dawned on his face as his thoughts worked. His childhood and past were very different from his current life. He recalled how ecstatic he had been when he first met his grandparents and learned about them. Relieved. Everything felt so far away now. That moment when he had been told that he was not human, not fully anyway, his mind had almost collapsed. His deepest fears seemed to have come true. That the villagers had been right all along, that they had always been right to exact justice on him, and that he was actually a demon, a monster spawn. However, this feeling was short-lived and was quickly eclipsed. Not being human did not seem to depress him too much. He recalled thinking that perhaps there were benefits to being a monster if being human meant being like the ignorant masses who tormented him. He remembered telling himself that, in the end, he was relieved that he had not been completely human. My family, including my grandfather, grandmother, Hitomi, Surara, and the unintentionally uttered last name, Mizore, had been introduced to me as a result of it. Why were his memories of that girl the most vivid? For some reason, whether it was the food she had eaten that day or some other small detail, her memories always stood out even when contrasted with those of his new family. He could have as easily summoned her by saying her name, because he heard footsteps and his ears pricked up. His senses honed in on the presence he felt above him on the cliff. Mizore's heart ached and he wondered why it was so familiar. Yes, it had hurt and still did, but was this how he was supposed to feel after losing a friend? He had no idea. He silently listened, picking up even the slightest sound with his heightened senses. Her breathing was rhythmic, and as she moved, the grass crumpled and her breathing sighed. Just the thing he needed right now, he thought with laced sarcasm. What am I supposed to do? Should I just check to see if she would be better off without me? Her laughs drifted down to him, and he unintentionally felt his heart lighten a little. Her friend's presence was detected by his senses. With extreme precision he could map out their actions in person. His senses gave him every bit of information and more than what normal eyes could ever hope to give. With his sophisticated mental skills already simulating the world above him, his mind processed every bit of data his senses could collect. The laughter as her friends challenged one another in pointless contests for Sukune's affection, the joyful taunts as they made fun of one another. The musical tunes of Mizore's voice etched themselves into his memory. Whether he was aware of it or not, he found himself making a declaration. Even if I am unable to be in close proximity to you, even if I am unable to communicate with you or play with you in the future, if it makes you happy, even if I have to suffer, it's worth it. Especially your beautiful laughs and happy smiles. Some level of him had said it, and had promised his own life for Mizore. No matter how hard he tried to act as though it didn't exist, there was still a void that was eating away at him and threatening to drain all of the good emotions from his heart. For the most part, her life had returned to normal. Everything had immediately returned to normal, with the exception of her daily healing sessions, during which Naruto was never present. She got up before the sun rose each morning. Before most people had even woken up, I was getting ready for the day. In 0.3 feet, which stands for natural hiding spot number 3 feet, she would always wait for him. Up above the ground, she was hidden behind a curtain of leaves as her head poked out from behind her cover. Her trusted diary held in one hand as she checked all her stalking equipment. She silently struck out N.7 on her list of hiding spots as she noticed a certain succubus sticking her claws into the bush. Kurumu had already compromised 25% of her hideouts, so she quickly checked and mentally noted that she should look for more places later. Her target emerged from the boys' dorm, drawing her attention to the entrance. Sukune left in her typical attire, which she observed was weak. She was unconsciously aware of his lack of self-assurance and bad posture. One of her enemies emerged from the wild, stopping her prejudicial thoughts in their tracks. Mocha gently took hold of his arm, and based on what she had seen thus far, she could easily count the seconds as they passed. 3, 2, 1. Mocha's "Kapu.Chu" was muffled by Sukune's manly scream as she drove her fangs into the boy's neck. Then, checking her schedule, she easily accounted for the next person's presence. Kurumu came in as usual, headstrong and powerful, as she pushed Mocha away and reprimanded her about draining Sukune dry. She then apologized as usual, though recently she had begun to express less regret to the succubus regarding the matter. She looked over her schedule once more and saw that Yukari would only be joining in at third period today. After that, it was all about her cue. Mizore. I know you're there, stop stalking Sukune.kun and come out. She blended into the foliage and trees, having already planned her route. Then, in accordance with her nature, she emerged behind the succubus, extending her aura to successfully sneak Kurumu once more. On the outside, she remained stoic, but on the inside, she couldn't help but laugh. She continued the daily tug-of-war by latching onto Sukune's left arm. She couldn't help but smile at the succubus's attempts to win Sukune and comebacks as she let her taunts run wild. Kurumu had thrown her a new taunt, which she mentally noted and would have to consider later. She would have to wait for the next chance for the time being. Even though she did it frequently and regularly, he never noticed it and it never failed. With her presence concealed, she silently pursued them. Their schedules didn't exactly coincide, which was a little annoying, but she was thankful for one thing. The school valued each yukai's unique needs and recognized that they were all different. There were multiple-spying classes on her daily schedule. Indirectly, it was a way of saying, stalking. Because when they felt like it, Yuki Ono were known to stalk their lovers and particular targets. As a result, they were given time to hone their abilities. It was currently one of those times, and Sukune's physical education period, based on her schedule. The smell of sweat hit her as soon as she glided into the gym hall, but she remained invisible. She wouldn't miss Sukune, so she kept her gaze fixed on the boy's changing room door. This was one of the best times of the week for her to see his body, which was characterized by his shirt sticking to him from the perspiration he had from working out and working hard. She chose to move to a different spot as soon as she saw his face in order to get a better look. Basic stretches were the first thing his class did. As he stretched, her gaze shifted to his legs, where she could just make out the faint lines defining his muscles. A ball flew past her and bounced on the wall, causing her to squeak a little. She moved slowly to another location, lowering her head to avoid being noticed. She would still be safe if the basketball rolled to a stop outside the wall. She tilted her head sideways and searched for Sukune. But instead, purple spheres locked onto something else. He, in her opinion, was a physical representation of perfection. Even when he jumped and moved, his muscles tensed and rippled majestically and rhythmically. Such perfection could not possibly be a mere person. He was flawless despite the small amount of perspiration that covered him. She could see the delicate details of his legs changing and shifting as he sprinted to the side to avoid an obstacle. She saw no crumples or folds in his clothing when he rolled beneath a bar and then got back up to jump diagonally to avoid a dangling block. It was flawless. He arrived at the finish line with divine grace. The body is balanced and the legs are evenly spread. As Mizore's inner instincts, particularly those fueled by her dying race to find a mate, stirred, she unconsciously licked her lips. However, his eyes conveyed a different message. He was guarded and lacked the happiness that comes from finishing the most challenging obstacle course at school. He approached it in a robotic and emotionless manner, as if he had done it merely for the sake of doing it. She was quickly distracted from his gaze, though. She was drawn to his face after noticing his well-known red hair. Her heart tightened. Why? She had just blurted out, Naruto, and had no idea why. Her heart pounded rapidly as she covered her chest with her right hand. As she collapsed onto the floor, her back propped up against the wall, her wide eyes gazed at his sad figure. Her heart ached for her friend while also feeling as though something was missing. Even though Mizore had known him for years, she had never once witnessed him exhibit such a depressing mood while he was awake. The only other occasions that had been close were the infrequent occasions when he had experienced his past haunting his dreams while he was sleeping. For a total of 2 seconds, Naruto cheered to himself. Without the use of Yuki or chakra, he had cleared the course with just his physical strength and agility. In addition, his body would not have been able to manage energy without pain at this time because he had overworked it in his PSC plan only a few days prior. Mizore was initially detected by Naruto's senses, but this was confirmed when he heard her whisper. He must have misheard her, though, because he shook his head. He had seen Sukune across the hall, and her intentions were clear. On rare occasions, Surara had taught him a few short lessons about the traditions and customs of Yuki. Ona, snow. Women, instead, Mizore was undoubtedly pursuing her true partner. A part of him winced at the idea. He had indeed been stalked by Mizore when they were younger. However, it had always been merely games and fun, right? He concluded solemnly in his mind. He jerked his thoughts out of the pool they were in and shook his head slightly. He was only here to observe before passing judgment, so it would not be beneficial to wander in those thoughts. Aaa sitting in her room, the young witch went through a number of books that described the various species of yokai. She read each book as fast as she could, but with the utmost care, as a big stack sat on her left. She attempted to match the being to a particular yokai type by recalling the day Naruto had appeared at school and engaged Kuyu in combat. By now, she had received at least a dozen, and the way things were going, it appeared that she would need to ask her parents for more. She sighed as some of her frustration came out. Her room's disarray did not help either. Books as thick as her head, books that weren't even rectangles, and plain parchments were all over the place, along with texts she had read. The bus driver said cryptically, "You know, there are certain people that you really shouldn't mess with." Yukari turned to the person who had given her the advice, and she jumped in her seat. The bus driver had entered without her knowledge and was standing next to her door. He was dressed in his typical uniform, which was spotless and flawless as usual, and his glowing eyes seemed to pierce her eyes. Her forming question was interrupted by the bus driver's instruction, "That book on your left, third from the bottom, his yokai type is detailed there." She complied because of the way he said it and the way he gazed at her. She set the targeted book on her table and pushed the existing items on her desk aside to create room. It appeared old, with worn pages and a plain cover that showed signs of age. Related stress. She opened it and skimmed the title. Yukari's body sagged back onto her chair, and her eyes grew wide. The bus driver's grin only grew bigger. She gave a robotic, faint nod in response, saying, "I trust that this will be our little secret for now." If her friends continued their behavior, they would face consequences. She became even more engrossed in her dazed state as a result of the mental simulations of her friends' deaths. He simply vanished from her room after saying, "Although, maybe you should tell this little tidbit to your Yuki. Ona friend." There was no indication that he had ever been here. He lit a cigarette outside and held it to his mouth before stepping on it and letting it fall behind him. He sighed nervously and leaned shakily against the tree. One of two outcomes could result from his small intervention. In the first, it would expedite the lovey-dovey relationship between the young phoenix and the snow girl, and he would win the small wager he made with Kazushi about when they would eventually start dating. Additionally, it would spare them all a great deal of trouble in the future when Naruto and Sukune's group clashed. However, if the witch approached it incorrectly, the two might never be able to get together. In that scenario, he would need to plan his escape before he was so severely burned that hell would actually seem cool. The reward so alluring that he would put his life in danger for it. A special powered engine for his vehicle that would enable him to perform 3 times as many stunts as he could at his current slow speed. The opportunity to boast in front of Kazushi? Were just advantageous? Aaa life at school had abruptly turned dull, or rather, it had always been dull. But she had never felt that way before. Why? In a sense, she knew. She had always been preoccupied with Sukune during her stay here. She would make plans to have Sukune all to herself, free from the clinging vampire, the obnoxious witch, and the cunning succubus. She had gradually become completely engrossed in her routine. Her eyes were filled with memories of the happiness she felt upon being accepted by Sukune and his group. The frequent smiles they shared and the challenging experiences they shared together. It was, in a sense, the ideal way of life, a pleasant balance of leisure and tranquility. As soon as he returned, everything had fallen into disarray. He was meant to be a thing of the past for her. Her mind had made a valiant effort to bury him and keep him in her past. But the idea of his coming back had never crossed her mind. In a matter of seconds, all her hard work had been uplifted and shaken. There was something deep within her that had forbidden him from remaining buried. It had caused her to pause, reflect, and uncover feelings and memories that had been painfully repressed. Her routine had been ruined, and no matter how hard she tried, she could never fully get back to what had been rendered impossible. She had been thinking about Naruto the entire time, even though her mind had told her to go back to Sukune. Her spying targets were constantly shifting, and she had to catch herself more times than she would like to admit. Subsequently, Naruto vanished from her perception, leaving her disoriented. That's exactly how it had felt. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. Nothing had been left behind to suggest that he had truly moved out of her line of sight or was repressing his strength. Her heart sank and her mind leapt, but had she failed to achieve her objective? She walked weakly back to Sukune, following her old route. She hid and watched, her eyes staring blankly, confused and unfocused. She experienced an uneasy and inexplicable reaction that overwhelmed her senses and distorted her thinking. Her heart was in contact with her hand. She felt a dull, paralyzing pain creep up her body, tightening around her chest and constricting her. For a moment, her wandering thoughts had concluded that something wasn't there. Naruto, Naruto, she replied in her head. Gradually, her thoughts turned to the boy, his appearance, his attire, the way he carried himself while going about his everyday business. Her thoughts flashed back to the night she had, technically unknowingly, proposed to him, the day she had met him, and the way he had referred to her as Angel. Her heart changed its beat to match her thoughts, accelerating to frantic speeds 1 minute and slowing to excruciating paces the next. Then everything came crashing down as her mind was consumed by a single memory from an hour earlier. The witch said, "Be careful, Mizore. I don't know what that red-haired boy has to do with you or us, but I did some research, and he isn't just any monster. He's actually one of the ancient species." She had also been affected by the overwhelming terror that had been emanating from her eyes. Despite Yukari's concerns, she hadn't given it much thought at the time, save for the fact that she was a little relieved to learn what Yukai Naruto was. After all, Naruto wouldn't do what the young witch feared, at least not without cause. On a more profound level, though, she had not yet come to any conclusions. Now, though, her mind was painfully making the connections despite her growing reluctance. In one way or another, ancient Yukai, monster, species were frequently extremely strong. A few vampires in history had occasionally shown strength comparable to that of the other ancient species, so they were in the same class, albeit barely. Legendary creatures that could not be grouped by a simple S rank of letters. Her thoughts, however, were centered on a characteristic that all of the legendary creatures had in common. They only ever perished when they were killed in combat or voluntarily took their own lives. They never died of old age. Thus, she was not immortal while Naruto was. Her heart grew icy. Was she being self-centered? She was not immortal, but she might live for hundreds or even 1,000 years if she was extremely fortunate. She would age and finally give in to the passage of time. In this harsh world, she would eventually have to leave Naruto alone. She could not keep him company indefinitely. They were not destined to be together, and even if Naruto did fall in love, it would only last a brief period of happiness before he lost her and the sadness began. Is she capable of doing this to him?
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.